Section 23 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Part 10. Like the coast region opposite Arvad, the shore which faced Tyre, lying between the mouth of the Litany and Ras El Ain, was an actual suburb of the city itself, with its gardens, its cultivated fields, its cemeteries, its villas, and its fortifications. Here the inhabitants of the island were accustomed to bury their dead, and hither they repaired for refreshment during the heat of the summer. To the north, the little town of Mahalaba, on the southern bank of the Litany, and almost hidden from view by a turn in the hills, commanded the approaches to the Bekaa and the high road to Syria. Footnote: Mahalaba is the present Kurbert Mahalib. End footnote. To the south, at Ras El Ain, Old Tyre, Palestyrus, looked down upon the route leading into Galilee by way of the mountains. Footnote: Palrotyrus has often been considered as a Tyre on the mainland of greater antiquity than the town of the same name on the island. It is now generally admitted that it was merely an outpost, which is conjecturally placed by most scholars in the neighborhood of Ras El Ain. End footnote. Eastwards, Autu commanded the landing places on the shore, and served to protect the reservoirs. It lay under the shadow of a rock, on which was built, facing the insular temple of Melkarth, protector of mariners, a sanctuary of almost equal antiquity dedicated to his namesake of the mainland. Footnote: If the name has been preserved, as I believe it to be, in that of El Awatin, the town must be that whose ruins we find at the foot of Tel Mashuk, and which are often mistaken for those of Palestyrus. The temple on the summit of the tell was probably that of Heracles Astracheton, mentioned by Nonus. End footnote. The latter divinity was probably the representative of the legendary Samumrum, who had built his village on the coast, while Usos had founded his on the ocean. He was the Baal Samum of Starry Tunic, Lord of Heaven and King of Sun. As was customary, a popular Astarte was associated with these deities of higher degree, and tradition asserted that Melkarth purchased her favor by the gift of the first robe of Tyrian purple which was ever dyed. Priestesses of the goddess had dwellings in all parts of the plain, and in several places the caves are still pointed out where they entertained the devotees of the goddess. Behind Autu the ground rises abruptly, and along the face of the escarpment, half hidden by trees and brushwood, are the remains of the most important of the Tyrian burying places, consisting of half-filled-up pits, isolated caves, and dark galleries, where whole families lie together in their last sleep. In some spots, the chalky mass has been literally honeycombed by the quarrying gravedigger, and regular lines of chambers follow one another in the direction of the strata, after the fashion of the rock-cut tombs of Upper Egypt. They present a bare and dismal appearance both within and without. The entrances are narrow and arched, the ceilings low, the walls bare and colorless, unrelieved by molding, picture, or inscription. At one place only, near the modern village of Hanawe, a few groups of figures and coarsely cut stelae are to be found, indicating it would seem the burying place of some chief of very early times. These figures run in parallel lines along the rocky sides of a wild ravine. They vary from 2 feet 6 inches to 3 feet in height, the bodies being represented by rectangular pilasters, sometimes merely rough-hewn, at others grooved with curved lines to suggest the folds of the Asiatic garments. The head is carved full face, though the eyes are given in profile, and the summary treatment of the modeling gives evidence of a certain skill. Whether they are to be regarded as the product of a primitive Amorite art, or of a school of Phoenician craftsmen, we are unable to determine. In the time of their prosperity, the Tyrians certainly pushed their frontier as far as this region. The wind-swept but fertile country lying among the ramifications of the lowest spurs of the Lebanon bears to this day innumerable traces of their indefatigable industry. Remains of dwellings, conduits, and watercourses, cisterns, pits, millstones, and vintage troughs are scattered over the fields, interspersed with oil and wine presses. The Phoenicians took naturally to agriculture, and carried it to such a high state of perfection as to make it an actual science, to which the neighboring peoples of the Mediterranean were glad to accommodate their modes of culture in later times. Footnote: Their taste for agriculture and the comparative perfection of their modes of culture are proved by the greatness of the remains still to be observed. Quote, "The Phoenicians constructed a winepress, a trough, to last forever." End quote. Their colonists at Carthage carried with them the same clever methods, and the Romans borrowed many excellent things in the way of agriculture from Carthaginian books, especially from those of Mago. End footnote. Among no other people was the art of irrigation so successfully practiced, and from such a narrow strip of territory as belonged to them, no other cultivators could have gathered such abundant harvests of wheat and barley, and such supplies of grapes, olives, and other fruits. From Arvad to Tyre, and even beyond it, the littoral region and the central parts of the valleys presented a long ribbon of verdure of varying breadth, where fields of corn were blended with gardens and orchards and shady woods. The whole region was independent and self-supporting, the inhabitants having no need to address themselves to their neighbors in the interior, or to send their children to seek their fortune in distant lands. To ensure prosperity, nothing was needed but a slight exercise of labor and freedom from the devastating influence of war. The position of the country was such as to secure it from attack, and from the conflicts which laid waste to the rest of Syria. Along almost the entire eastern border of the country, the Lebanon was a great wall of defense running parallel to the coast, strengthened at each extremity by the additional protection of the rivers Nahr el-Kabir and Litani. Its slopes were further defended by the forest, which, with its lofty trees and brushwood, added yet another barrier to that afforded by rocks and snow. Hunters' or shepherds' paths led here and there in tortuous courses from one side of the mountain to the other. Near the middle of the country, 2 roads, practicable in all seasons, secured communications between the littoral and the plain of the interior. They branched off on either side from the central road in the neighborhood of Tabaki, south of Kodshu, and served the needs of the wooded province of Megara. Footnote: Megara is mentioned in the Anastasi Papyrus No. 1, and Chabas has identified it with the plain of Makra, which Strabo places in Syria in the neighborhood of Eleutheros. End footnote. This region was inhabited by pillaging tribes, which the Egyptians called at one time Lamnana, the Libanites. Footnote: The name Lamnana is given in a picture of the campaigns of Seti I. End footnote. At other, Shalsu, using for them the same appellation as that which they bestowed upon the Bedouin of the desert. The roads through this province ran under the dense shade afforded by oaks, cedars, and cypresses, in an obscurity favorable to the habits of the wolves and hyenas which infested it, and even of those thick-maned lions known to Asia at the time, and then proceeding in its course, crossed the ridge in the neighborhood of the snow peak called Shawa, which is probably the Sanin of our times, while one of these roads, running north along the lake of Yamuna and through the gorge of Akura, then proceeded along the Adonis. Footnote: This is the road pointed out by Renan as the easiest but least known of those which crossed the Lebanon. The remains of an Assyrian inscription graven on the rocks near Ain el-Asafir show that it was employed from a very early date, and Renan thought that it was used by the armies which came from the upper valley of the Orontes. End footnote. To Byblos, the other took a southern direction and followed the Nahr el-Kelb to the sea. Towards the mouth of the latter, a wall of rock opposes the progress of the river, and leaves at length but a narrow and precipitous defile for the passage of its waters. A pathway cut into the cliff at a very remote date leads almost perpendicularly from the bottom of the precipice to the summit of the promontory. Commerce followed these short and direct routes, but invading hosts very rarely took advantage of them, although they offered access into the very heart of Phoenicia. Invaders would encounter here, in fact, a little-known and broken country, lending itself readily to surprises and ambuscades, and should they reach the foot of the Lebanon range, they would find themselves entrapped in a region of slippery defiles, with steep paths at intervals cut into the rock, and almost inaccessible to chariots or horses, and so narrow in places that a handful of resolute men could have held them for a long time against whole battalions. The enemy preferred to make for the 2 natural breaches at their respective extremities of the line of defense, and for the 2 insular cities which flanked the approaches to them. Tyre in the case of those coming from Egypt, Arvad and Samira for assailants from the Euphrates. The Arvadians, bellicose by nature, would offer strong resistance to the invader and not permit themselves to be conquered without a brave struggle with the enemy, however powerful he might be. Footnote: Thutmosis III was obliged to enter on a campaign against Arvad in the year 29, in the year 30, and probably twice in the following years. Under Amenhotep III and IV, we see that these people took part in all the intrigues directed against Egypt. They were the allies of the Khati against Ramses II in the campaign of the year 5, and later on we find them involved in most of the wars against Assyria. End footnote. When the disproportion of the forces which they could muster against the enemy convinced them of the folly of attempting an open conflict, their island home offered them a refuge where they would be safe from any attacks. Sometimes the burning and pillaging of their property on the mainland might reduce them to throw themselves on the mercy of their foes, but such submission did not last long, and they welcomed the slightest occasion for regaining their liberty. Conquered again and again on account of the smallness of their numbers, they were never discouraged by their reverses, and Phoenicia owed all its military history for a long period to their prowess. The Tyrians were of a more accommodating nature, and there was no evidence, at least during the early centuries of their existence, of the display of those obstinate and blind transports of bravery by which the Arvadians were carried away. Footnote: No campaign against Tyre is mentioned in any of the Egyptian annals. The expedition of Thutmosis III against Senzaru was directed against a town of Cilicia mentioned in the Tel el Amarna tablets, with the orthography Zinzar, the Caesarea Larissa of Greco-Roman times, the Shizar of the Arab chronicles. On the contrary, the Tel el Amarna tablets contain several passages which manifest the fidelity of Tyre and its governors to the king of Egypt. End footnote. Their foreign policy was reduced to a simple arithmetical question, which they discussed in the light of their industrial or commercial interests. As soon as they had learned from a short experience that a certain pharaoh had at his disposal armies against which they could offer no serious opposition, they at once surrendered to him and thought only of obtaining the greatest profit from the vassalage to which they were condemned. The obligation to pay tribute did not appear to them so much in the light of a burden or a sacrifice, as a means of purchasing the right to go to and fro freely in Egypt, or in the countries subject to its influence. The commerce acquired by these privileges recouped them more than 100-fold for all that their overlord demanded from them. The other cities of the coast, Sidon, Berytus, Byblos, usually followed the example of Tyre, whether from mercenary motives or from their naturally pacific disposition, or from a sense of their impotence. In the same intelligent resignation with which, as we know, they accepted the supremacy of the great Egyptian empire, was doubtless displayed in earlier centuries in their submission to the Babylonians. Their records show that they did not accept this state of things merely through cowardice or indolence, for they are represented as ready to rebel and shake off the yoke of their foreign master when they found it incompatible with their practical interests. But their resort to war was exceptional. They generally preferred to submit to the powers that be, and to accept from them as if on lease the strip of coastline at the base of the Lebanon, which served as a site for their warehouses and dockyards. Thus they did not find the yoke of the stranger irksome, the sea opening up to them a realm of freedom and independence which compensated them for the limitations of both territory and liberty imposed upon them at home. The epoch which was marked by their first venture on the Mediterranean, and the motives which led to it, were alike unknown to them. The gods had taught them navigation, and from the beginning of things they had taken to the sea as fishermen, or as explorers in search of new lands. Footnote: According to one of the cosmogonies of Sanchonathan, Kusor, who has been identified with Hephaestus, was the inventor of the fishing boat and was the first among men and gods who taught navigation. According to another legend, Melkarth showed the Tyrians how to make a raft from the branches of a fig tree, while the construction of the first ships is elsewhere ascribed to the Kabiri. End footnote. They were not driven by poverty to leave their continental abode, or inspired thereby with a zeal for distant cruises. They had at home sufficient corn and wine, oil and fruits, to meet all their needs, and even to administer to a life of luxury. And if they lacked cattle, the abundance of fish within their reach compensated for the absence of flesh meat. Nor was it the number of commodiously situated ports on their coast which induced them to become a seafaring people, for their harbors were badly protected for the most part and offered no shelter when the wind set in from the north, the rugged shore presenting little resource against the wind and waves in its narrow and shallow havens. It was the nature of the country itself which contributed more than anything else to make them mariners. The precipitous mountain masses which separate one valley from another rendered communication between them difficult, while they served also as lurking places for robbers. Commerce endeavored to follow, therefore, the sea route in preference to the devious ways of this highwayman's region, and it accomplished its purpose the more readily because the common occupation of sea fishing had familiarized the people with every nook and corner on the coast. The continual wash of the surge had worn away the bases of the limestone cliffs, and the superincumbent masses tumbling down into the sea formed lines of rocks, hardly rising above the water level, which fringed the headlands with perilous reefs, against which the waves broke continuously at the slightest wind. It required some bravery to approach them, and no little skill to steer one of the frail boats, which these people were accustomed to employ from the earliest times, scatheless amid the breakers. The coasting trade was attracted from Arvad successively to Berytus, Sidon, and Tyre, and finally to the other towns of the coast. It was in full operation, doubtless, from the 6th Egyptian dynasty onwards, when the pharaohs no longer hesitated to embark troops at the mouth of the Nile for speedy transmission to the provinces of southern Syria, and it was by this coasting route that the tin and amber of the north succeeded in reaching the interior of Egypt. The trade was originally, it would seem, in the hands of those mysterious Kefatiu, of whom the name only was known in later times. When the Phoenicians established themselves at the foot of the Lebanon, they had probably only to take the place of their predecessors, and to follow the beaten tracks which they had already made. We have every reason to believe that they took to a seafaring life soon after their arrival in the country, and that they adapted themselves in their civilization readily to the exigencies of a maritime career. Footnote: connection between Phoenicia and Greece was fully established at the outbreak of the Egyptian wars, and we may safely assume their existence in the centuries immediately preceding the second millennium before our era. End footnote. In their towns, as in most seaports, there was a considerable foreign element, both of slaves and freemen, but the Egyptians confounded them all under one name, Kefatiu, whether they were Cypriotes, Asiatics, or Europeans, or belonged to the true Tyrian and Sidonian race. The costume of the Kefiti was similar to that worn by the people of the interior, the loincloth with or without a long upper garment. While untiring the hair, they adopted certain refinements, especially a series of curls which the men arranged in the form of an aigrette above their foreheads. This motley collection of races was ruled over by an oligarchy of merchants and ship owners, whose functions were hereditary and who usually paid homage to a single king, the representative of the tutelary god and absolute master of the city. Footnote: under the Egyptian supremacy, the local princes did not assume the royal title in the dispatches which they addressed to the kings of Egypt, but styled themselves governors of their cities. End footnote. End of section 23, read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 24 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4, by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Part 11. The industries pursued in Phoenicia were somewhat similar to those of other parts of Syria. The stuffs, vases, and ornaments made at Tyre and Sidon could not be distinguished from those of Hamath or of Carchemish. All manufactures bore the impress of Babylonian influence, and their implements, weights, measures, and system of exchange were the same as those in use among the Chaldeans. The products of the country were, however, not sufficient to freight the fleets which sailed from Phoenicia every year bound for all parts of the known world, and additional supplies had to be regularly obtained from neighboring peoples, who thus became used to pour into Tyre and Sidon the surplus of their manufactures, or of the natural wealth of their country. The Phoenicians were also accustomed to send caravans into regions which they could not reach in their carracks, and to establish trading stations at the fords of rivers or on the passes over mountain ranges. We know of the existence of such emporia at Laish, near the sources of the Jordan, at Thapsacus, and at Nisibis, and they must have served the purpose of a series of posts on the great highways of the world. The settlements of the Phoenicians always assumed the character of colonies, and however remote they might be from their fatherland, the colonists never lost the manners and customs of their native country. They collected together into their okels, or storehouses, such wares and commodities as they could purchase in their new localities, and, transmitting them periodically to the coast, shipped them thence to all parts of the world. Not only were they acquainted with every part of the Mediterranean, but they had even made voyages beyond its limits. In the absence, however, of any specific records of their naval enterprise, the routes they followed must be a subject of conjecture. They were accustomed to relate that the gods, after having instructed them in the art of navigation, had shown them the way to the setting sun, and had led them by their example to make voyages even beyond the mouths of the ocean. El of Byblos was the first to leave Syria. He conquered Greece and Egypt, Sicily and Libya, civilizing their inhabitants, and laying the foundation of cities everywhere. The Sidonian Astarte, with her head surmounted by the horns of an ox, was the next to begin her wanderings over the inhabited earth. Melkarth completed the task of the gods by discovering and subjugating those countries which had escaped the notice of his predecessors. Hundreds of local traditions, to be found on all the shores of the Mediterranean down to Roman times, bore witness to the pervasive influence of the old Canaanite colonization. At Cyprus, for instance, we find traces of the cultus of Kineiros, king of Byblos and father of Adonis. Again, at Crete, it is the daughter of a prince of Sidon, Beropa, who was carried off by Zeus under the form of a bull. It was Cadmus, sent forth to seek Beropa, who visited Cyprus, Rhodes, and the Cyclades before building Thebes in Boeotia, and dined in the forests of Illyria. In short, wherever the Phoenicians had obtained a footing, their audacious activity made such an indelible impression upon the mind of the native inhabitants that they never forgot those vigorous, thick-set men with pale faces and dark beards, and soft and specious speech, who appeared at intervals in their large and swift-sailing vessels. They made their way cautiously along the coast, usually keeping in sight of land, making sail when the wind was favorable, or taking to the oars for days together when occasion demanded it, anchoring at night under the shelter of some headland, or in bad weather hauling their vessels up the beach until the morrow. They did not shrink when it was necessary from trusting themselves to the open sea, directing their course by the pole star. Footnote: the Greeks for this reason called it Phoenike, the Phoenician star. Ancient writers refer to the use which the Phoenicians made of the pole star to guide them in navigation. End footnote. In this manner they often traversed long distances out of sight of land, and they succeeded in making in a short time voyages previously deemed long and costly. It is hard to say whether they were as much merchants as pirates. Indeed, they hardly knew themselves, and their peaceful or warlike attitude toward vessels which they encountered on the seas, or towards the people whose countries they frequented, was probably determined by the circumstances of the moment. Footnote: the manner in which the Phoenicians plied their trade is strikingly described in the Odyssey, in the part where Eumaeus relates how he was carried off by a Sidonian vessel and sold as a slave. See the passage which mentions the ravages of the Greeks on the coast of the Delta. Herodotus recalls the rape of Io, daughter of Inachos, by the Phoenicians, who carried her and her companions into Egypt. On the other hand, during one of their Egyptian expeditions, they had taken 2 priestesses from Thebes and had transported one of them to Dodona, the other into Libya. End footnote. If on arrival at a port they felt themselves no match for the natives, the instinct of the merchant prevailed, and that of the pirate was kept in the background. They had landed peaceably, gained the goodwill of the native chief and his nobles by small presents, and spreading out their wares, contented themselves, if they could do no better, with the usual advantage obtained in an exchange of goods. They were never in a hurry, and would remain in one spot until they had exhausted all the resources of the country, while they knew to a nicety how to display their goods attractively before the expected customer. Their wares comprised weapons and ornaments for men, axes, swords, incised or damascene daggers with hilts of gold or ivory, bracelets, necklaces, amulets of all kinds, enameled vases, glasswork, stuffs dyed purple or embroidered with gay colors. At times the natives, whose cupidity was excited by the exhibition of such valuables, would attempt to gain possession of them either by craft or by violence. They would kill the men who had landed, or attempt to surprise the vessel during the night. But more often it was the Phoenicians who took advantage of the friendliness or the weakness of their hosts. They would turn treacherously upon the unarmed crowd when absorbed in the interest of buying and selling. Robbing and killing the old men, they would make prisoners of the young and strong, the women and children, carrying them off to sell them in those markets where slaves were known to fetch the highest price. This was a recognized trade, but it exposed the Phoenicians to the danger of reprisals, and made them objects of an undying hatred. When on these distant expeditions, they were subject to trivial disasters which might lead to serious consequences. A mast might break, an oar might damage a portion of the bulwarks, a storm might force them to throw overboard part of their cargo or their provisions. In such predicaments, they had no means of repairing the damage, and, unable to obtain help in any of the places they might visit, their prospects were of a desperate character. They soon therefore learned the necessity of establishing cities of refuge at various points in the countries with which they traded, stations where they could go to refit and revictual their vessels, to fill up the complement of their crews, to take in new freight, and, if necessary, pass the winter, or wait for fair weather, before continuing their voyage. For this purpose they chose by preference islands lying within easy distance of the mainland, like their native cities of Tyre and Arvad, but possessing a good harbor or roadstead. If the island were not available, they selected a peninsula with a narrow isthmus, or a rock standing at the extremity of a promontory, which a handful of men could defend against any attack, and which could be seen from a considerable distance by their pilots. Most of their stations thus happily situated became at length important towns. They were frequented by the natives from the interior, who allied themselves with the newcomers, and furnished them not only with objects of trade, but with soldiers, sailors, and recruits for their army. And such was the rapid spread of these colonies, that before long the Mediterranean was surrounded by an almost unbroken chain of Phoenician strongholds and trading stations. All the towns of the mother country, Arvad, Byblos, Berytus, Tyre, and Sidon, possessed vessels engaged in cruising long before the Egyptian conquest of Syria. We have no direct information from any existing monument to show us what these vessels were like, but we are familiar with the construction of the galleys which formed the fleets of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. The art of shipbuilding had made considerable progress since the times of the Memphite kings. From the period when Egypt aspired to become one of the great powers of the world, she doubtless endeavored to bring her naval force to the same pitch of perfection as her land forces could boast of, and her fleets probably consisted of the best vessels which the dockyards of that day could turn out. Phoenician vessels of this period may therefore be regarded with reason as constructed on lines similar to those of the Egyptian ships, differing from them merely in the minor details of the shape of the hull and manner of rigging. The hull continued to be built long and narrow, rising at the stem and stern. The bow was terminated by a sort of hook, to which, in time of peace, a bronze ornament was attached, fashioned to represent the head of a divinity, gazelle, or bull, while in times of war this was superseded by a metal cutwater made fast to the hull by several turns of stout rope, the blade rising some couple of yards above the level of the deck. Footnote: to get a clear idea of the details of the structure, we have only to compare the appearance of ships with and without a cutwater in the scenes at Thebes, representing the celebration of a festival at the return of the fleet. End footnote. The poop was ornamented with a projection firmly attached to the body of the vessel, but curved inwards and terminated by an open lotus flower. An upper deck, surrounded by a wooden rail, was placed at the bow and stern to serve as forecastle and quarterdecks respectively, and in order to protect the vessel from the danger of heavy seas, the ship was strengthened by a structure to which we find nothing analogous in the shipbuilding of classical times. An enormous cable attached to the gammonings of the bow rose obliquely to a height of about a couple of yards above the deck, and passing over 4 small crutched masts, was made fast again to the gammonines of the stern. The hull measured from the blade of the cutwater to the sternpost some 20 to 25 yards, but the lowest part of the hold did not exceed 5 feet in depth. There was no cabin, and the ballast, arms, provisions, and spare rigging occupied the open hold. Footnote: Monsieur Glasser thinks that there were cabins for the crew under the deck, and he recognizes in the 16 oblong marks on the sides of the vessels at Deir el-Bahari so many deadlights. As there could not have been space for so many cabins, I had concluded that these were ports for oars to be used in time of battle, but on further consideration I saw that they represented the ends of the beams supporting the deck. End footnote. The bulwarks were raised to a height of some 2 feet, and the thwarts of the rowers ran up to them on both the port and starboard sides, leaving an open space in the center for the longboat, bales of merchandise, soldiers, slaves, and additional passengers. Footnote. One of the bas-reliefs exhibits a longboat in the water at the time the fleet was at anchor at Puanat. As we do not find any vessel towing one after her, we naturally conclude that the boat must have been stowed on board. End footnote. A double set of steering oars and a single mast completed the equipment. The latter, which rose to a height of some 26 feet, was placed amidships and was held in an upright position by stays. The masthead was surmounted by 2 arrangements which answered respectively to the top, gaby, and cowset of the masts of a galley. Footnote. The gaby was a species of top where a sailor was placed on the lookout. The cowset is, properly speaking, a square block of wood containing the sheaves on which the halyards traveled. The Egyptian apparatus had no sheaves and answers to the cowset on the masts of a galley only in its serving the same purpose. End footnote. There were no shrouds on each side from the masthead to the rail, but in place of them 2 stays ran respectively to the bow and stern. The single square sail was extended between 2 yards some 60 to 70 feet long, and each made of 2 pieces spliced together at the center. The upper yard was straight, while the lower curved upward at the ends. The yard was hoisted and lowered by 2 halyards, which were made fast aft at the feet of the steersman. The yard was kept in its place by 2 lifts, which came down from the masthead, and were attached respectively about 8 feet from the end of each yard arm. When the yard was hauled up, it was further supported by 6 auxiliary lifts, 3 being attached to each yard arm. The lower yard, made fast to the mast by a figure of 8 knot, was secured by 16 lifts, which, like those of the upper yard, worked through the cowset. The crew comprised 30 rowers, 15 on each side, 4 topmen, 2 steersmen, a pilot at the bow, who signaled to the men at the helm the course to steer, a captain and a governor of the slaves, who formed, together with 10 soldiers, a total of some 50 men. Footnote. I have made this calculation from an examination of the scenes in which ships are alternatively represented as at anchor and under way. I know of vessels of smaller size and consequently with a smaller crew, but I know of none larger or more fully manned. End footnote. In time of battle, as the rowers would be exposed to the missiles of the enemy, the bulwarks were further heightened by a mantlet, behind which the oars could be freely moved, while the bodies of the men were fully protected, their heads alone being visible above it. The soldiers were stationed as follows. 2 of them took their places on the forecastle, a third was perched on the masthead in a sort of cage improvised on the bars forming the top, while the remainder were posted on the deck and poop, from which positions, and while waiting for the order to board, they could pour a continuous volley of arrows on the archers and sailors of the enemy. Footnote. The details are taken from the only representation of the naval battle which we possess up to this moment, namely, that of which I shall have occasion to speak further on in connection with the reign of Ramses III. End footnote. End of section 24. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 25 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Part 12. The first colony of which the Phoenicians made themselves masters was that island of Cyprus, whose low, lurid outline they could see on fine summer evenings in the glow of the western sky. Some 110 miles in length and 36 in breadth, it is driven like a wedge into the angle which Asia Minor makes with the Syrian coast. It throws out to the northeast a narrow strip of land, somewhat like an extended finger pointing to where the two coasts meet at the extremity of the Gulf of Issos. A limestone cliff of almost uniform height throughout bounds, for half its length at least, the northern side of the island, broken occasionally by short, deep valleys, which open out into creeks deeply embayed. A scattered population of fishermen exercise their calling in this region, and small towns of which we possess only the Greek or Greekized name, Carpasia, Aphrodisian, Carinea, Lapethos, led there a slumbering existence. Almost in the center of the island, two volcanic peaks, Troades and Olympos, face each other and rise to a height of nearly 7,000 feet, the range of mountains to which they belong, that of Eus, forming the framework of the island. The spurs of this range fall by a gentle gradient towards the south, and spread out either into stony slopes favorable to the culture of the vine, or into great maritime flats fringed with brackish lagoons. The valley which lies on the northern side of this chain runs from sea to sea in an almost unbroken level. A scarcely perceptible watershed divides the valley into two basins similar to those of Syria, the larger of the two lying opposite to the Phoenician coast. The soil consists of black mold, as rich as that of Egypt, and renewed yearly by the overflowing of the Pedaios and its affluents. Thick forests occupied the interior, promising inexhaustible resources to any naval power. Even under the Coman emperors, the Cypriotes boasted that they could build and fit out a ship from the keel to the masthead without looking to resources beyond those of their own island. The ash, pine, cypress, and oak flourished on the sides of the range of Eus, while cedars grew there to a greater height and girth than even on the Lebanon. Wheat, barley, olive trees, vines, sweet-smelling woods for burning on the altar, medicinal plants such as the poppy and the laudanum, henna for staining with a deep orange color the lips, eyelids, palm, nails, and fingertips of the women, all found here a congenial habitat. While a profusion everywhere of sweet-smelling flowers, which saturated the air with their penetrating odors, spring violets, many-colored anemones, the lily, hyacinth, crocus, narcissus, and wild rose, led the Greeks to bestow upon the island the designation of the balmy cypress. Mines also contributed their share to the riches of which the island could boast. Iron in small quantities, alum, asbestos, agate, and other precious stones are still to be found there, and in ancient times the neighborhood of Tamasus yielded copper in such quantities that the Romans were accustomed to designate this metal by the name cyprium, and the word passed from them into all the languages of Europe. It is not easy to determine the race to which the first inhabitants of the island belonged, if we are not to see them a branch of the Cafatiu, who frequented the Asiatic shores of the Mediterranean from a very remote period. In the time of Egyptian supremacy, they called their country Assi, and this name inclines one to connect the people with the Aegeans. Footnote: Assi, Assii, was at first sought for on the Asiatic continent, at Is, on the Euphrates, or in Palestine. The discovery of the canopic decree allows us to identify it with Cyprus, and this has now been generally done. The reading Asebi is still maintained by some. End footnote. An examination of the objects found in the most ancient tombs of the island seems to confirm this opinion. These consist for the most part of weapons and implements of stone, knives, hatchets, hammers, and arrowheads, and mingled with these rude objects a score of different kinds of pottery, chiefly handmade and of coarse design. Pitchers with contorted bowls, shallow buckets, especially of the milk pail variety, provided with spouts and with pairs of rudimentary handles. The pottery is red or black in color, and the ornamentation of it consists of incised geometrical designs. Copper and bronze, where we find examples of these metals, do not appear to have been employed in the manufacture of ornaments or arrowheads, but usually in making daggers. There is no indication anywhere of foreign influence, and yet Cyprus had already at this time entered into relations with the civilized nations of the continent. Footnote: An examination into the origin of the Cypriotes formed part of the original scheme of this work, together with that of the monuments of the various races scattered along the coast of Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean. But I have been obliged to curtail it in order to keep within the limits I had prescribed for myself, and I have merely epitomized, as briefly as possible, the results of the researches undertaken in those regions during the last few years. End footnote. According to Chaldean tradition, it was conquered about the year 3800 BC by Sargon of Agade. Without insisting upon the reality of this conquest, which in any case must have been ephemeral in its nature, there is reason to believe that the island was subjected from an early period to the influence of the various peoples which lived one after another on the slopes of the Lebanon. Popular legend attributes to King Cinyras and to the Giblites, i.e. the people of Byblos, the establishment of the first Phoenician colonies in the southern region of the island, one of them being at Paphos, where the worship of Adonis and Astarte continued to a very late date. The natives preserved their own language and customs, had their own chiefs, and maintained their national independence, while constrained to submit at the same time to the presence of Phoenician colonists or merchants on the coast, and in the neighborhood of the mines and the mountains. The trading centers of these settlers, Kition, Amathus, Solius, Golgos, and Tamasus, were soon, however, converted into strongholds, which ensured to Phoenicia the monopoly of the immense wealth contained in the island. Footnote. The Phoenician origin of these towns is proved by passages from classical writers. The date of the colonization is uncertain, but with the knowledge we possess of the efficient vessels belonging to the various Phoenician towns, it would seem difficult not to allow that the coasts, at least of Cyprus, must have been partially occupied at the time of the Egyptian invasions. End footnote. Tyre and Sidon had no important centers of industry on that part of the Canaanite coast, which extended to the south of Carmel, and Egypt, even in the time of the shepherd kings, would not have tolerated the existence on her territory of any great emporium not subject to the immediate supervision of her official agents. We know that the Libyan cliffs long presented an obstacle to inroads into Egyptian territory, and baffled any attempts to land to the westwards of the delta. The Phoenicians consequently turned with all the greater ardor to those northern regions, which for centuries had furnished them with most valuable products, bronze, tin, amber, and iron, both native and wrought. A little to the north of the Orontes, where the Syrian border is crossed and Asia Minor begins, the coast turns due west and runs in that direction for a considerable distance. The Phoenicians were accustomed to trade along this region, and we may attribute, perhaps, to them the foundation of those obscure cities, Kibria, Masura, Euskopus, Silion, Migdale, and Sidima. Footnote. No direct evidence exists to lead us to attribute the foundation of these towns to the Phoenicians, but the Semitic origin of nearly all the names is an uncontested fact. End footnote. All of which preserve their apparently Semitic names down to the time of the Roman epoch. The whole of the important island of Rhodes fell into their power, and its three ports, Ialissos, Lindos, and Kamiros, afforded them a well-situated base of operations for further colonization. On leaving Rhodes, the choice of two routes presented itself to them. To the southwest, they could see the distant outline of Carpathos, and on the far horizon behind it the summits of the Cretan chain. Crete itself bars on the south the entrance to the Aegean, and is almost a little continent, self-contained and self-sufficing. It is made up of fertile valleys and mountains clothed with forests, and its inhabitants could employ themselves in mines and fisheries. The Phoenicians effected a settlement on the coast at Etanos, at Kairos, and at Arados, and obtained the possession of the peak of Kythera, where, it is said, they raised a sanctuary to Astarte. If, on leaving Rhodes, they had chosen to steer due north, they would soon have come into contact with numerous rocky islets, scattered in the sea between the continents of Asia and Europe, which would have furnished them with as many stations, less easy of attack, and more readily defended than posts on the mainland. Of these, the Giblites occupied Melos, while the Sidonians chose Oliaros and Thera, and we find traces of them in every island where any natural product, such as metals, sulfur, alum, fuller's earth, emery, medicinal plants, and shells for producing dyes, offered an attraction. The purple used by the Tyrians for dyeing is secreted by several varieties of mollusks, common in the eastern Mediterranean. Those most esteemed by the dyers was the Murex trunculus and the Murex brandaris, and solid masses made up of the detritus of these shells are found in enormous quantities in the neighborhood of many Phoenician towns. The coloring matter was secreted in the head of the shellfish. To obtain it, the shell was broken by a blow from a hammer, and the small quantity of slightly yellowish liquid which issued from the fracture was carefully collected and stirred about in salt water for 3 days. It was then boiled and let in vessels and reduced by simmering over a slow fire. The remainder was strained through a cloth to free it from the particles of flesh still floating in it, and the material to be dyed was then plunged into the liquid. The usual tint thus imparted was that of fresh blood, and some lights almost approaching to black, but careful manipulation could produce shades of red, dark violet, and amethyst. Phoenician settlements can be traced, therefore, by the heaps of shells upon the shore, the Cyclades and the coasts of Greece being strewn with this refuse. The veins of gold in the Pangaion range in Macedonia attracted them off the Thracian coast. Footnote: the fact that they worked the mines of Thasos is attested by Herodotus. End footnote. Received also frequent visits from them, and they carried their explorations even through the tortuous channel of the Hellespont into the Propontis, drawn thither, no doubt, by the silver mines in the Bithynian mountains. Footnote: Pronectos, on the Gulf of Ascania, was supposed to be a Phoenician colony. End footnote. Which were already being worked by the Asiatic miners. Beyond the calm waters of the Propontis, they encountered an obstacle to their progress in another narrow channel, having more the character of a wide river than of a strait. It was with difficulty that they could make their way against the violence of its current, which either tended to drive their vessels on shore, or dash them against the reefs which hampered the navigation of the channel. When, however, they succeeded in making the passage safely, they found themselves upon a vast and stormy sea, whose wooded shores extended east and west as far as eye could reach. From the tribes who inhabited them, and who acted as intermediaries, the Phoenician traders were able to procure tin, lead, amber, Caucasian gold, bronze, and iron, all products of the extreme north, a region which always seemed to elude their persevering efforts to discover it. We cannot determine the furthest limits reached by the Phoenician traders, since they were wont to designate the distant countries and nations with which they traded by the vague appellations of Isles of the Sea and Peoples of the Sea, refusing to give more accurate information either from jealousy or from a desire to hide from other nations the sources of their wealth. The peoples with whom they traded were not mere barbarians contented with worthless objects of barter. Their clients included the inhabitants of the Aegean, who, if inferior to the great nations of the East, possessed an independent and growing civilization, traces of which are still coming to light from many quarters in the shape of tombs, houses, palaces, utensils, ornaments, representations of the gods, and household and funerary furniture, not only in the Cyclades, but on the mainland of Asia Minor and of Greece. No inferior goods or tinsel wares would have satisfied the luxurious princes who reigned in such ancient cities as Troy and Mycenae, and who wanted the best industrial products of Egypt and Syria, costly stuffs, rare furniture, ornate and well-wrought weapons, articles of jewelry, vases of curious and delicate design, such objects, in fact, as would have been found in use among the sovereigns and nobles of Memphis or of Babylon. For articles to offer in exchange, they were not limited to the natural or roughly worked products of their own country. Their craftsmen, though less successful in general technique than their Oriental contemporaries, exhibited considerable artistic intelligence and an extraordinary manual skill. Accustomed at first merely to copy the objects sold to them by the Phoenicians, they soon developed a style of their own. The Mycenaean dagger in the illustration on page 299, though several centuries later in date than that of the pharaoh Ahmosis, appears to be traceable to this ancient source of inspiration, although it gives evidence of new elements in its method of decoration and in its greater freedom of treatment. The inhabitants of the valleys of the Nile and of the Orontes, and probably also those of the Euphrates and Tigris, agreed in the high value they set upon these artistic objects in gold, silver, and bronze, brought to them from the further shores of the Mediterranean, which, while reproducing their own designs, modified them to a certain extent. For just as we now imitate types of ornamental work in vogue among nations less civilized than ourselves, So the Aegean people set themselves the task through their potters and engravers of reproducing exotic models. The Phoenician traders who exported to Greece large consignments of objects made under various influences in their own workshops, or purchased in the bazaars of the ancient world, brought back as a return cargo an equivalent number of works of art bought in the towns of the West, which eventually found their way into the various markets of Asia and Africa. These energetic merchants were not the first to ply this profitable trade of maritime carriers, for from the time of the Memphite Empire, the products of northern regions had found their way, through the intermediation of the Hau and Nibu, as far south as the cities of the Delta and the Thebaid. But this commerce could not be said to be either regular or continuous. The transmission was carried on from one neighboring tribe to another, and the Syrian sailors were merely the last in a long chain of intermediaries. A tribal war, a migration, the caprice of some chief, being sufficient to break the communication, and even cause the suspension of transit for a considerable period. The Phoenicians desired to provide against such risks by undertaking themselves to fetch the much coveted objects from their respective sources, or where this was not possible, from the ports nearest the place of their manufacture. Reappearing with each returning year in the localities where they had established emporia, they accustomed the natives to collect against their arrival such products as they could profitably use in bartering with one or other of their many customers. They thus established on a fixed line of route a kind of maritime trading service, which placed all the shores of the Mediterranean in direct communication with each other, and promoted the blending of the youthful West with the ancient East. End of section 25. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 26 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Egyptian-Theban Dynasty. The account of the first expedition undertaken by Thutmosis in Asia, a region at that time new to the Egyptians, would be interesting if we could lay our hands upon it. We should perhaps find in the midst of official documents, or among the short phrases of funerary biographies, some indication of the impression which the country produced upon its conquerors. With the exception of a few merchants or adventurers, no one from Thebes to Memphis had any other idea of Asia than that which could be gathered from the scattered notices of it in the semi-historical romances of the preceding age. The actual sight of the country must have been a revelation, everything appearing new and paradoxical to men of whom the majority had never left their fatherland, except on some warlike expedition into Ethiopia, or on some rapid raid along the coasts of the Red Sea. Instead of their own narrow valley extending between its two mountain ranges, and fertilized by the periodical overflowing of the Nile, which recurred regularly almost to a day, they had before them wide, irregular plains, owing their fertility not to inundations, but to occasional rains or the influence of insignificant streams, hills of varying heights covered with vines and other products of cultivation, mountains of different altitudes irregularly distributed, clothed with forests, furrowed with torrents, their summits often crowned with snow even in the hottest period of summer. And in this region of nature, where everything was strange to them, they found nations differing widely from each other in appearance and customs, towns with crenellated walls, perched upon heights difficult of access, and finally a civilization far excelling that which they encountered anywhere in Africa outside their own boundaries. Thutmosis succeeded in reaching on his first expedition a limit which none of his successors were able to surpass, and the road taken by him in this campaign, from Gaza to Megiddo, from Megiddo to Kodshu, from Kodshu to Carchemish, was that which was followed henceforward by the Egyptian troops in all their expeditions to the Euphrates. Of the difficulties which he encountered on his way we have no information. On arriving at Nahraim, however, we know that he came into contact with the army of the enemy, which was under the command of a single general, perhaps the king of Mitanni himself, or one of the lieutenants of the Kassian king of Babylon, who had collected together most of the petty princes of the northern country to resist the advance of the intruder. The contest was hotly fought out on both sides, but victory at length remained with the invaders, and innumerable prisoners fell into their hands. The veteran Ahmosi, son of Abina, who was serving in his last campaign, and his cousin Ahmosi Penekabit distinguished themselves according to their wont. The former, having seized upon a chariot, brought it, with the 3 soldiers who occupied it, to the pharaoh, and received once more the collar of gold. The latter killed 21 of the enemy, carrying off their hands as trophies, captured a chariot, took 1 prisoner, and obtained as reward a valuable collection of jewelry consisting of collars, bracelets, sculptured lions, choice vases, and costly weapons. A stele, erected on the banks of the Euphrates not far from the scene of the battle, marked the spot which the conqueror wished to be recognized henceforth as the frontier of his empire. He re-entered Thebes with immense booty, by which gods as well as men profited, for he consecrated a part of it to the embellishment of the temple of Ammon, and the sight of the spoil undoubtedly removed the lingering prejudices which the people had cherished against expeditions beyond the isthmus. Thutmosis was held up by his subjects to the praise of posterity as having come into actual contact with that country and its people, which had hitherto been known to the Egyptians merely through the more or less veracious tales of exiles and travelers. The aspect of the great river the Nahraim, which could be compared with the Nile for the volume of its waters, excited their admiration. They were, however, puzzled by the fact that it flowed from north to south, and even were accustomed to the joke at the necessity of reversing the terms employed in Egypt to express going up or down the river. This first Syrian campaign became the model for most of those subsequently undertaken by the pharaohs. It took the form of a bold advance of troops directed from Zalu towards the northeast in a diagonal line through the country, who routed on the way any armies which might be opposed to them, carrying by assault such towns as were easy of capture, while passing by others which seemed strongly defended, pillaging, burning, and slaying on every side. There was no suspension of hostilities, no going into winter quarters, but a triumphant return of the expedition at the end of 4 or 5 months, with the probability of having to begin fresh operations in the following year should the vanquished break out into revolt. Footnote. From the account of the campaigns of Amenophanes II, I thought we might conclude that this pharaoh wintered in Syria at least once, but the text does not admit of this interpretation, and we must, therefore, for the present, give up the idea that the pharaohs ever spent more than a few months of the year on hostile territory. End footnote. The troops employed in these campaigns were superior to any others hitherto put into the field. The Egyptian army, inured to war by its long struggle with the shepherd kings, and kept in training since the reign of Ahmosis by having to repulse the perpetual incursions of the Ethiopian or Libyan barbarians, had no difficulty in overcoming the Syrians. Not that the latter were wanting in courage or discipline, but owing to their limited supply of recruits and the political disintegration of the country, they could not readily place under arms such enormous numbers as those of the Egyptians. Egyptian military organization had remained practically unchanged since early times. The army had always consisted, firstly, of the militia who held fiefs, and were under the obligation of personal service either to the prince of the nome or to the sovereign. Secondly, of a permanent force, which was divided into 2 corps, distributed respectively between the Said and the Delta. Those companies which were quartered on the frontier, or about the king either at Thebes or at one of the royal residences, were bound to hold themselves in readiness to muster for a campaign at any given moment. The number of natives liable to be levied when occasion required by generations, or we should say by classes, may have amounted to over 100,000 men. Footnote. The only numbers which we know are those given by Herodotus for the Site period, which are evidently exaggerated. Coming down to modern times, we see that Mehmet Ali, from 1830 to 1840, had nearly 120,000 men in Syria, Egypt, and the Sudan, and in 1841, at the time when the treaties imposed upon him the ill-kept obligation of reducing his army to 18,000 men, it still contained 81,000. We shall probably not be far wrong in estimating the total force which the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, lords of the whole valley of the Nile, and of part of Asia, had at their disposal at 120,000 or 130,000 men. These, however, were never all called out at once. End footnote. but they were never all called out, and it does not appear that the army on active service ever contained more than 30,000 men at a time, and probably on ordinary occasions not much more than 10 or 15,000. Footnote. We have no direct information respecting the armies acting in Syria. We only know that at the Battle of Kodshu, Ramses II had against him 2,500 chariots containing 3 men each, making 7,500 charioteers, besides a troop estimated at the Ramesseum at 8,000 men, at Luxor at 9,000, so that the Syrian army probably contained about 20,000 men. It would seem that the Egyptian army was less numerous, and I estimate it with great hesitation at about 15,000 or 18,000 men. It was considered a powerful army, while that of the Hittites was regarded as an innumerable host. A passage in the Anastasia Papyrus No. 1 tells us the composition of a corps led by Ramses II against the tribes in the vicinity of Kosir in the Rahanu Valley. It consisted of 5,000 men, of whom 620 were Shardana, 1,600 were Kahak, 70 were Mashawasha, and 880 Negroes. End footnote. The infantry was, as we should expect, composed of troops of the line and light troops. The former wore either short wigs arranged in rows of curls or a kind of padded cap by way of a helmet, thick enough to deaden blows. The breast and shoulders were undefended, but a short loincloth was wrapped around the hips, and the stomach and upper part of the thighs were protected by a sort of triangular apron, sometimes scalloped at the sides, and composed of leather thongs attached to a belt. A buckler of moderate dimensions had been substituted for the gigantic shield of the earlier Theban period. It was rounded at the top and often furnished with a solid metal boss, which the experienced soldiers always endeavored to present to the enemy's lances and javelins. Their weapons consisted of pikes about 5 feet long, with broad bronze or copper points, occasionally of flails, axes, daggers, short curved swords, and spears. The trumpeters were armed with daggers only, and the officers did not, as a rule, encumber themselves with either buckler or pike, but bore an axe and a dagger, and occasionally a bow. The light infantry was composed chiefly of bowmen, pedatu, the celebrated archers of Egypt, whose long bows and arrows, used with deadly skill, speedily became renowned throughout the East. The quiver, of the use of which their ancestors were ignorant, had been borrowed from the Asiatics, probably from the Hyksos, and was carried hanging at the side or slung over the shoulder. Both spearmen and archers were for the most part pure-bred Egyptians, and were divided into regiments of unequal strength, each of which usually bore the name of some god, as for example the regiment of Ra, or of Tha, or of Amon, or of Sutku. Footnote. The army of Ramses II at the Battle of Kodshu comprised 4 corps, which bore the names of Amon, Ra, Tha, and Sutku. Other lesser corps were named the tribe of Pharaoh, the tribe of the beauty of the solar dish. These, as far as I can judge, must have been troops raised on the royal domains by a system of local recruiting, who were united by certain common privileges and duties which constituted them a hereditary militia, whence they were called tribes. End footnote. In which the feudal contingents, each commanded by its lord or his lieutenants, fought side by side with the king's soldiers furnished from the royal domains. The effective force of the army was made up by auxiliaries taken from the tribes of the Sahara and from the Negroes of the Upper Nile. Footnote. These Ethiopian recruits are occasionally represented in the Theban tombs of the 18th dynasty, among others in the tomb of Pa-Sukir. End footnote. These auxiliaries were but sparingly employed in early times, but their numbers were increased as wars became more frequent and necessitated more troops to carry them on. The tribes from which they were drawn supplied the pharaohs with an inexhaustible reserve. They were courageous, active, indefatigable, and inured to hardships, and if it had not been for their turbulent nature, which incited them to continual internal dissensions, they might readily have shaken off the yoke of the Egyptians. Incorporated into the Egyptian army and placed under the instruction of picked officers, who subjected them to rigorous discipline and accustomed them to the evolutions of regular troops, they were transformed from disorganized hordes into tried and invincible battalions. Footnote. The armies of Hatshepsut already included Libyan auxiliaries, some of which are represented at Deir el-Bahari, Others of Asiatic origin are found under Amenophes IV, but they are not represented on the monuments among the regular troops until the reign of Ramses II, when the Chaldea appear for the first time among the king's bodyguard. End footnote. The old army, which had conquered Nubia in the days of the Papus and Usurtacens, had consisted of these three varieties of foot soldiers only, but since the invasion of the shepherds, a new element had been incorporated into the modern army in the shape of the chariotry, which answered to some extent to the cavalry of our day as regards their tactical employment and efficacy. The horse, when once introduced into Egypt, soon became fairly adapted to its environment. It retained both its height and size, keeping the convex forehead, which gave the head a slightly curved profile, the slender neck, the narrow hindquarters, the lean and sinewy legs, and the long flowing tail which had characterized it in its native country. The climate, however, was enervating, and constant care had to be taken, by the introduction of new blood from Syria, to prevent the breed from deteriorating. Footnote: the number of horses brought from Syria either as spoils of war or as tribute paid by the vanquished are frequently recorded in the annals of Thutmose III. Besides the usual species, powerful stallions were imported from northern Syria, which were known by the Semitic name of Abiri, the Strong. In the tombs of the 18th dynasty, the arrival of Syrian horses in Egypt is sometimes represented. End footnote. The pharaohs kept studs of horses in the principal cities of the Nile Valley, and the great feudal lords, following their own example, vied with each other in the possession of numerous breeding stables. The office of superintendent to these establishments, which was at the disposal of the master of the horse, became in later times one of the most important state appointments. Footnote: in the story of the conquest of Egypt by the Ethiopian Pianki, studs are indicated at Hermopolis, at Athribis, in the towns to the east and in the center of the delta, and at Sais. Diodorus Siculus relates that, in his time, the foundations of 100 stables, each capable of containing 200 horses, were still to be seen on the western bank of the river between Memphis and Thebes. End footnote. The first chariots introduced into Egypt were, like the horses, of foreign origin, but when built by Egyptian workmen they soon became more elegant, if not stronger than their models. Lightness was the quality chiefly aimed at, and at length the weight was so reduced that it was possible for a man to carry his chariot on his shoulders without fatigue. The materials for them were on this account limited to oak or ash and leather, metal, whether gold or silver, iron or bronze, being used but sparingly, and then only for purposes of ornamentation. The wheels usually had 6, but sometimes 8 spokes, or occasionally only 4. The axle consisted of a single stout pole of acacia. The framework of the chariot was composed of 2 pieces of wood mortised together so as to form a semicircle or half ellipse, enclosed by a straight bar. To this frame was fixed a floor of sycamore wood or of plaited leather thongs. The sides of the chariot were formed of upright panels, solid in front and open at the sides, each provided with a handrail. The pole, which was of a single piece of wood, was bent into an elbow at about 1/5 of its length from the end, which was inserted into the center of the axle-tree. On the gigantic T thus formed was fixed the body of the chariot, the hinder part resting on the axle and the front attached to the bent part of the pole, while the whole was firmly bound together with double leather thongs. A yoke of hornbeam, shaped like a bow, to which the horses were harnessed, was fastened to the other extremity of the pole. The Asiatics placed 3 men in a chariot, but the Egyptians only 2. The warrior, Sinai, whose business it was to fight, and the shield-bearer, Kazana, who protected his companion with the buckler during the engagement. A complete set of weapons was carried in the chariot: lances, javelins, and daggers, curved spear, club, and battle-axe, while 2 bow cases as well as 2 large quivers were hung at the sides. The chariot itself was very liable to upset, the slightest cause being sufficient to overturn it. Even when moving at a slow pace, the least inequality of the ground shook it terribly, and when driven at full speed it was only by a miracle of skill that the occupants could maintain their equilibrium. At such times the charioteer would stand astride of the front panels, keeping his right foot only inside the vehicle, and planting the other firmly on the pole, so as to lessen the jolting, and to secure a wider base on which to balance himself. To carry all this into practice, long education was necessary, for which there were special schools of instruction, and those who were destined to enter the army were sent to these schools when little more than children. To each man, as soon as he had thoroughly mastered all the difficulties of the profession, a regulation chariot and pair of horses were granted, for which he was responsible to the pharaoh or to his generals, and he might then return to his home until the next call to arms. The warrior took precedence of the shield-bearer, and both were considered superior to the foot soldier. The chariotry, in fact, like the cavalry of the present day, was the aristocratic branch of the army, in which the royal princes, together with the nobles and their sons, enlisted. No Egyptian ever willingly trusted himself to the back of a horse, and it was only in the thick of a battle, when his chariot was broken and there seemed no other way of escaping from the melee, that a warrior would venture to mount one of his steeds. There appear, however, to have been here and there a few horsemen, who acted as couriers or aides de camp. They used neither saddlecloth nor stirrups, but were provided with reins with which to guide their animals, and their seat on horseback was even less secure than the footing of the driver in his chariot. The infantry was divided into platoons of 6 to 10 men each, commanded by an officer and marshaled round an ensign, which represented either a sacred animal, an emblem of the king or of his double, or a divine figure placed upon the top of a pike. This constituted an object of worship to the group of soldiers to whom it belonged. We are unable to ascertain how many of these platoons, either of infantry or of chariotry, were to form a company or a battalion, or by what ensigns the different grades were distinguished from each other, or what was their relative order of rank. Bodies of men, to the number of 40 or 50, are sometimes represented on the monuments, but this may be merely by chance, or because the draftsmen did not take the trouble to give the proper number accurately. The inferior officers were equipped very much like the soldiers, with the exception of the buckler, which they do not appear to have carried, and certainly did not when on the march. The superior officers might be known by their umbrella or flabellum, a distinction which gave them the right of approaching the king's person. The military exercises to which all these troops were accustomed probably differed but little from those which were in vogue with the armies of the ancient empire. They consisted in wrestling, boxing, jumping, running either singly or in line at regular distances from each other, manual exercises, fencing, and shooting at a target. The war dance had ceased to be in use among the Egyptian regiments as a military exercise, but it was practiced by the Ethiopian and Libyan auxiliaries. At the beginning of each campaign, the men destined to serve in it were called out by the military scribes, who supplied them with arms from the royal arsenals. Then followed the distribution of rations. The soldiers, each carrying a small linen bag, came up in squads before the commissariat officers, and each received his own allowance. Footnote: we see the distribution of arms made by the scribes and other officials of the royal arsenals represented in the pictures at Medinet Abu. The calling out of the classes was represented in the Egyptian tombs of the 18th dynasty, as well as the distribution of supplies. End footnote. End of section 26. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 27 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Part 2. Once in the enemy's country, the army advanced in close order, the infantry in columns of 4, the officers in rear, and the chariots either on the right or left flank, or in intervals between divisions. Skirmishers thrown out to the front cleared the line of march, while detached parties pushing right and left collected supplies of cattle, grain, or drinking water from the fields and unprotected villages. The main body was followed by the baggage train. It comprised not only supplies and stores, but cooking utensils, coverings, and the entire paraphernalia of the carpenters' and blacksmiths' shops necessary for repairing bows, lances, daggers, and chariot poles, the whole being piled up in 4-wheeled carts drawn by asses or oxen. The army was accompanied by a swarm of non-combatants, scribes, soothsayers, priests, heralds, musicians, servants, and women of loose life, who were a serious cause of embarrassment to the generals and a source of perpetual danger to military discipline. At nightfall, they halted in a village, or more frequently bivouacked in an entrenched camp, marked out to suit the circumstances of the case. This entrenchment was always rectangular, its length being twice as great as its width, and was surrounded by a ditch, the earth from which, being banked up on the inside, formed a rampart from 5 to 6 feet in height. The exterior of this was then entirely faced with shields, square below but circular in shape at the top. The entrance to the camp was by a single gate in one of the longer sides, and a plank served as a bridge across the trench, close to which 2 detachments of mounted guard, armed with clubs and naked swords. The royal quarters were situated at one end of the camp. Here, within an enclosure, rose an immense tent, where the pharaoh found all the luxury to which he was accustomed in his palaces, even to a portable chapel, in which, each morning, he could pour out water and burn incense to his father Amon-Ra of Thebes. The princes of the blood who formed his escort, his shield-bearers, and his generals, were crowded together hard by, and beyond in closely packed lines, were the horses and chariots, the draft bullocks, the workshops, and the stores. The soldiers, accustomed from childhood to live in the open air, erected no tents or huts of boughs for themselves in these temporary encampments, but bivouacked in the open, and the sculptures on the facades of the Theban pylons give us a minute picture of the way in which they employed themselves when off duty. Here one man, while cleaning his armor, superintends the cooking. Another, similarly engaged, drinks from a skin of wine held up by a slave. A third has taken his chariot to pieces and is replacing some portion of the worse for wear. Some are sharpening their daggers or lances, others mend their loincloths or sandals, or exchange blows with fists and sticks. The baggage, linen, arms, and provisions are piled in disorder on the ground. Horses, oxen, and asses are eating or chewing the cud at their ease, while here and there a donkey, relieved of his burden, rolls himself on the ground and brays with delight. Footnote: we are speaking of the camp of Thutmosis III near Aluna the day before the Battle of Megiddo, and the words put into the mouths of the soldiers to mark their vigilance are the same as those which we find in the Ramesseum and at Luxor, written above the guards of the camp where Ramses II is reposing. End footnote. The success of the Egyptians in battle was due more to the courage and hardihood of the men than to the strategical skill of their commanders. We find no trace of maneuvers, in the sense in which we understand the word, either in their histories or on their bas-reliefs. But they joined battle boldly with the enemy, and the result was decided by a more or less bloody conflict. The heavy infantry was placed in the center, the chariots were massed on the flanks, while light troops thrown out to the front began the action by letting fly volleys of arrows and stones, which through the skill of the bowmen and slingers did deadly execution. Then the pikemen laid their spears in rest, and pressing straight forward, threw their whole weight against the opposing troops. At the same moment the charioteers set off at a gentle trot, and gradually quickened their pace till they dashed at full speed upon the foe, amid the confused rumbling of wheels and the sharp clash of metal. The Egyptians, accustomed by long drilling to the performance of such evolutions, executed these charges as methodically as though they were still on their parade ground at Thebes. If the disposition of the ground were at all favorable, not a single chariot would break the line, and the columns would sweep across the field without swerving or falling into disorder. The charioteer had the reins tied round his body, and could, by throwing his weight either to the right or the left, or by slackening or increasing the pressure through a backward or forward motion, turn, pull up, or start his horses by a simple movement of the loins. He went into battle with bent bow, the string drawn back to his ear, the arrow leveled ready to let fly, while the shield-bearer, clinging to the body of the chariot with one hand, held out his buckler with the other to shelter his comrade. It would seem that the Syrians were less skillful. Their bows did not carry so far as those of their adversaries, and consequently they came within the enemy's range some moments before it was possible for them to return the volley with effect. Their horses would be thrown down, their drivers would fall wounded, and the disabled chariots would check the approach of those following and overturn them, so that by the time the main body came up with the enemy, the slaughter would have been serious enough to render victory hopeless. Nevertheless, more than one charge would be necessary finally to overturn or scatter the Syrian chariots, which, once accomplished, the Egyptian charioteer would turn against the foot soldiers, and, breaking up their ranks, would tread them down under the feet of his horses. Footnote: the whole of the above description is based on incidents from the various pictures of battles which appear on the monuments of Ramses II. End footnote. Nor did the pharaoh spare himself in the fight. His splendid dress, the urasus on his forehead, and the nodding plumes of his horses made him a mark for the blows of the enemy, and he would often find himself in positions of serious danger. In a few hours, as a rule, the conflict would come to an end. Once the enemy showed signs of giving way, the Egyptian chariots dashed upon them precipitously and turned the retreat into a rout. The pursuit was, however, never a long one. Some fortress was always to be found close at hand where the remnant of the defeated host could take refuge. Footnote. After the Battle of Megiddo, the remnants of the Syrian army took refuge in the city, where Thutmose III besieged them. Similarly, under Ramses II, the Hittite princes took refuge in Kodshu after their defeat. End footnote. The victors, moreover, would be too eager to secure the booty and to strip the bodies of the dead to allow time for following up the foe. The prisoners were driven along in platoons, their arms bound in strange and contorted attitudes, each under the charge of his captor. Then came the chariots, arms, slaves, and provisions collected on the battlefield or in the camp, then other trophies of a kind unknown in modern warfare. When an Egyptian killed or mortally wounded anyone, he cut off not the head but the right hand, or the phallus, and brought it to the royal scribes. These made an accurate inventory of everything, and even Pharaoh did not disdain to be present at the registration. The booty did not belong to the persons who obtained it, but was thrown into a common stock which was placed at the disposal of the sovereign. One part he reserved for the gods, especially for his father Amon of Thebes, who had given him the victory. Another part he kept for himself, and the remainder was distributed among his army. Each man received a reward in proportion to his rank and services, such as male or female slaves, bracelets, necklaces, arms, vases, or a certain measured weight of gold, known as the gold of bravery. A similar sharing of the spoil took place after every successful engagement. From Pharaoh to the meanest camp follower, every man who had contributed to the success of a campaign returned home richer than he had set out, and the profits which he derived from a war were a liberal compensation for the expenses in which it had involved him. The results of the first expedition of Thutmose I were of a decisive character, so much so indeed that he never again, it would seem, found it necessary during the remainder of his life to pass the isthmus. Northern Syria, it is true, did not remain long under tribute, if indeed it paid any at all after the departure of the Egyptians. But the southern part of the country, feeling itself in the grip of the new master, accepted its defeat. Gaza became the headquarters of a garrison which secured the door of Asia for further invasion. Footnote. This fact is nowhere explicitly stated on the monuments. We may infer it, however, from the way in which Thutmose III tells how he reached Gaza without opposition at the beginning of his first campaign, and celebrated the anniversary of his coronation there. On the other hand, we learn from details in the lists that the mountains and plains beyond Gaza were in a state of open rebellion. End footnote. And Pharaoh, freed from anxiety in this quarter, gave his whole time to the consolidation of his power in Ethiopia. The river and desert tribes of this region soon forgot the severe lesson which he had given them. As soon as the last Egyptian soldier had left their territory, they rebelled once more and began a fresh series of inroads which had to be repressed anew year after year. Thutmose I had several times to drive them back in the years 2 and 3, but was able to make short work of their rebellions. An inscription at Tombos on the Nile, in the very midst of the disturbed districts, told them in brave words what he was and what he had done since he had come to the throne. Wherever he had gone, weapon in hand, quote, seeking a warrior, he had found none to withstand him. He had penetrated to valleys which were unknown to his ancestors, the inhabitants of which had never beheld the wearers of the double diadem. End quote. All this would have produced but little effect had he not backed up his words by deeds and taken decisive measures to restrain the insolence of the barbarians. Tombos lies opposite Tahanik, at the entrance to that series of rapids known as the Third Cataract. The course of the Nile is here barred by a formidable dike of granite, through which it has hollowed out 6 winding channels of varying widths, dotted here and there with huge polished boulders and verdant islets. When the inundation is at its height, the rocks are covered and the rapids disappear, with the exception of the lowest, which is named Locali, where faint eddies mark the place of the more dangerous reefs, and were it not that the fall here is rather more pronounced and the current somewhat stronger, few would suspect the existence of a cataract at the spot. As the waters go down, however, the channels gradually reappear. When the river is at its lowest, the 3 westernmost channels dry up almost completely, leaving nothing but a series of shallow pools. Those on the east still maintain their flow, but only one of them, that between the islands of Tombos and Abaddon, remains navigable. Here Thutmose built, under invocation of the gods of Heliopolis, one of those brickwork citadels with its rectangular keep, which set at naught all the efforts and all the military science of the Ethiopians. Attached to it was a harbor, where each vessel on its way downstream put in for the purpose of hiring a pilot. The monarchs of the 12th and 13th dynasties had raised fortifications at the approaches to Wadi Haifa, and their engineers skillfully chose the site so as completely to protect from the ravages of the Nubian pirates that part of the Nile which lay between Wadi Haifa and Filsa.
Footnote: the foundation of this fortress is indicated in an emphatic manner in the Tombos inscription. Quote,
"The masters of the great castle, the gods of Heliopolis, have made a fortress for the soldiers of the king, which the 9 peoples of Nubia combined could not carry by storm, for, like a young panther before a bull which lowers its head, the souls of his majesty have blinded them with fear." End quote. Quarries of considerable size, where Caliud imagined he could distinguish an overturned colossus, show the importance which the establishment had attained in ancient times.
The ruins of the town cover a fairly large area near the modern village of Kerman. End footnote. Henceforward, the garrison at Tombos was able to defend the mighty curve described by the river through the desert of Mahas, together with the island of Argo and the confines of Dongola.
The distance between Thebes and this southern frontier was a long one, and communication was slow during the winter months, when the subsidence of the waters had rendered the task of navigation difficult for the Egyptian ships. The king was obliged, besides, to concentrate his attention mainly on Asiatic affairs, and was no longer able to watch the movements of the African races with the same vigilance as his predecessors had exercised before Egyptian armies had made their way as far as the banks of the Euphrates. Thutmose placed the control of the countries south of Aswan in the hands of a viceroy, who, invested with the august title of Royal Son of Kush, must have been regarded as having the blood of Ra himself running in his veins. Footnote: the meaning of this title was at first misunderstood. Champollion and Rossellini took it literally and thought it referred to Ethiopian princes who were vassals or enemies of Egypt. Birch persists in regarding them as Ethiopians driven out by their subjects, restored by the pharaohs as viceroys, while admitting that they may have belonged to the Solar family. End footnote. Sura, the first of these viceroys, whose name has reached us, was in office at the beginning of the campaign of the year 3. Footnote: he is mentioned in the Sahel inscriptions as, quote, the royal son Sura, end quote. Nahi, who had been regarded as the first holder of the office, and who was still in office under Thutmose III, had been appointed by Thutmose I, but after Sura. End footnote. He belonged, it would seem, to a Theban family, and for several centuries afterwards his successors are mentioned among the nobles who were in the habit of attending the court. Their powers were considerable. They commanded armies, built or restored temples, administered justice, and received the homage of loyal sheiks or the submission of rebellious ones. Footnote: under Thutmose III, the viceroy Nahi restored the temple at Semneh. Under Tutankhamun, the viceroy Hui received tribute from the Ethiopian princes and presented them to the sovereign. End footnote. The period for which they were appointed was not fixed by law, and they held office simply at the king's pleasure. During the 19th dynasty, it was usual to confer this office, the highest in the state, on a son of the sovereign, preferably the heir apparent. Occasionally his appointment was purely formal, and he continued in attendance on his father, while a trusty substitute ruled in his place. Often, however, he took the government on himself, and in the regions of the Upper Nile served an apprenticeship to the art of ruling. This district was in a perpetual state of war, a war without danger, but full of trickery and surprises. Here he prepared himself for the larger arena of the Syrian campaigns, learning the arts of generalship more perfectly than was possible in the maneuvers of the parade ground. Moreover, the appointment was dictated by religious as well as by political considerations. The presumptive heir to the throne was to his father what Horus had been to Osiris. His lawful successor, or if need be his avenger, should some act of treason impose on him the duty of vengeance. And was it not in Ethiopia that Horus had gained his first victories over Typhon? To begin like Horus and flesh his maiden steel with the descendants of the accomplices of Sit was, in the case of the future sovereign, equivalent to affirming from the outset the reality of his divine extraction. Footnote: in the Orbani papyrus, the title of Prince of Kush was assigned to the heir presumptive to the throne. End footnote. End of section 27, read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 28 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Part 3. As at the commencement of the Theban dynasties, it was the river valley only in these regions of the Upper Nile which belonged to the pharaohs. From this time onward, it gave support to an Egyptian population as far as the juncture of the two Niles. It was a second Egypt, but a poorer one, whose cities presented the same impoverished appearance as that which we find today in the towns of Nubia. The tribes scattered right and left in the desert, or distributed beyond the confluence of the two Niles among the plains of Sennar, were descended from the old indigenous races, and paid valuable tribute every year in precious metals, ivory, timber, or the natural products of their districts, under penalty of armed invasion. Footnote: the tribute of the Ganbatiu, or people of the south, and that of Cush and of the Uauayu, is mentioned repeatedly in the annals of Thutmosis III for the year 31, for the year 33, and for the year 34. The regularity with which this item recurs, unaccompanied by any mention of war, following after each Syrian campaign, shows that it was a habitual operation which was registered as an understood thing. True, the inscription does not give the item for every year, but then it only dealt with Ethiopian affairs insofar as they were subsidiary to events in Asia. The payment was nonetheless an annual one, the amount varying in accordance with local agreement. End footnote. Among these races were still to be found descendants of the Mazayu and the Uauayu, who, in days gone by, had opposed the advance of the victorious Egyptians. The name of the Uauayu was indeed used as a generic term to distinguish all those tribes which frequented the mountains between the Nile and the Red Sea. Footnote: the annals of Thutmosis III mention the tribute of Puanit for the peoples of the coast, the tribute of Uauite for the people of the mountain between the Nile and the sea, the tribute of Cush for the peoples of the south, or Ganbatiu. End footnote. But the wave of conquest had passed far beyond the boundaries reached in early campaigns, and had brought the Egyptians into contact with nations with whom they had been in only indirect commercial relations in former times. Some of these were light-colored men of a type similar to that of the modern Abyssinians or Gallas. They had the same haughty and imperious carriage, the same well-developed and powerful frames, and the same love of fighting. Most of the remaining tribes were of black blood, and such of them as we see depicted on the monuments resemble closely the Negroes inhabiting Central Africa at the present day. They have the same elongated skull, the low prominent forehead, hollow temples, short flattened nose, thick lips, broad shoulders, and salient breast, the latter contrasting sharply with the undeveloped appearance of the lower part of the body, which terminates in thin legs almost devoid of calves. Egyptian civilization had already penetrated among these tribes, and as far as dress and demeanor were concerned, their chiefs differed in no way from the great lords who formed the escort of the pharaoh. We see these provincial dignitaries represented in white robe and petticoat of starched, pleated, and goffered linen, an innate taste for bright colors, even in those early times, being betrayed by the red or yellow scarf in which they wrapped themselves, passing it over one shoulder and round the waist, whence the ends depended and formed a kind of apron. A panther's skin covered the back, and one or two ostrich feathers waved from the top of the head or were fastened on one side to the fillet confining the hair, which was arranged in short curls and locks, stiffened with gum and matted with grease, so as to form a sort of cap or grotesque aureole round the skull. The men delighted to load themselves with rings, bracelets, earrings, and necklaces, while from their arms, necks, and belts hung long strings of glass beads, which jingled with every movement of the wearer. They seem to have frequently chosen a woman as their ruler, and her dress appears to have closely resembled that of the Egyptian ladies. She appeared before her subjects in a chariot drawn by oxen, and protected from the sun by an umbrella edged with fringe. The common people went about nearly naked, having merely a loincloth of some woven stuff or an animal's skin thrown round their hips. Their heads were either shaven or adorned with tufts of hair stiffened with gum. The children of both sexes wore no clothes until the age of puberty. The women wrapped themselves in a rude garment or in a covering of linen and carried their children on the hip or on a basket of esparto grass on the back, supported by a leather band which passed across the forehead. One characteristic of all these tribes was their love of singing and dancing and their use of the drum and cymbals. They were active and industrious and carefully cultivated the rich soil of the plain, devoting themselves to the raising of cattle, particularly of oxen, whose horns they were accustomed to train fantastically into the shapes of lyres, bows, and spirals, with bifurcations at the ends, or with small human figures as terminations. As in the case of other Negro tribes, they plied the blacksmiths and also the goldsmiths' trade, working up both gold and silver into rings, chains, and quaintly shaped vases, some specimens of their art being little else than toys, similar in design to those which delighted the Byzantine Caesars of later date. A wall painting remains of a gold epergne, which represents men and monkeys engaged in gathering the fruit of a group of dom palms. 2 individuals lead each a tame giraffe by the halter, others kneeling on the rim raise their hands to implore mercy from an unseen enemy, while Negro prisoners, groveling on their stomachs, painfully attempt to raise their head and shoulders from the ground. This doubtless represents a scene from the everyday life of the people of the Upper Nile, and gives a faithful picture of what took place among many of its tribes during a rapid inroad of some viceroy of Kush, or a raid by his lieutenants. The resources which Thutmose I was able to draw regularly from these southern regions, in addition to the wealth collected during his Syrian campaign, enabled him to give a great impulse to building work. The tutelary deity of his capital, Amon-Ra, who had ensured him the victory in all his battles, had a prior claim on the bulk of the spoil. He received it as a matter of course, and his temple at Thebes was thereby considerably enlarged. We are not, however, able to estimate exactly what proportion fell to other cities, such as Cuma, Elephantine. Footnote. Wiedemann found his name there cut in a block of brown freestone. End footnote. Abydos. Footnote. Asteliot Abydos speaks of the building operations carried on by Thutmose I in that town. End footnote. In Memphis, where a few scattered blocks of stone still bear the name of the king, troubles broke out in Lower Egypt, but they were speedily subdued by Thutmose, and he was able to end his days in the enjoyment of a profound peace, undisturbed by any care save that of ensuring a regular succession to his throne and of restraining the ambitions of those who looked to become possessed of his heritage. Footnote. The expressions from which we gather that his reign was disturbed by outbreaks of internal rebellion seem to refer to a period subsequent to the Syrian expedition, and prior to his alliance with the princess Hatshepsut. End footnote. His position was indeed a curious one. Although de facto absolute in power, his children by Queen Ahmasi took precedence of him, for by her mother's descent she had a better right to the crown than her husband, and legally the king should have retired in favor of his sons as soon as they were old enough to reign. The eldest of them, Uazmosu, died early. Footnote. Uazmosu is represented on the tomb of Pahiri at El Kab, where Mr. Griffith imagines he can trace 2 distinct Uazmosu. For the present, I am of the opinion that there was but one, the son of Thutmose I. His funerary chapel was discovered at Thebes. It is in a very bad state of preservation. End footnote. The second, Amenenmosu, lived at least to attain adolescence. He was allowed to share the crown with his father from the 4th year of the latter's reign, and he also held a military command in the Delta. Footnote. Amenmosu is represented at El Kab by the side of his brother Uazmosu, also on a fragment where we find him in the 4th year of his father's reign, honored with a cartouche at Memphis, and consequently associated with his father in the royal power. End footnote. But before long he also died, and Thutmose I was left with only one son, a Thutmose like himself, to succeed him. The mother of this prince was a certain Mutnofrit. Footnote. Mutnofrit was supposed by Mariette to have been a daughter of Thutmose II. The statue reproduced on page 345 has shown us that she was wife of Thutmose I and mother of Thutmose II. End footnote. Half-sister to the king on his father's side, who enjoyed such a high rank in the royal family that her husband allowed her to be portrayed in royal dress. Her pedigree on the mother's side, however, was not so distinguished, and precluded her son from being recognized as heir apparent. Hence the occupation of the seat of Horus reverted once more to a woman, Hatshepsut, the eldest daughter of Ahmasi. Hatshepsut herself was not, however, of purely divine descent. Her maternal ancestor, Sonosonbu, had not been a scion of the royal house, and this flaw in her pedigree threatened to mar, in her case, the sanctity of the solar blood. According to Egyptian belief, this defect of birth could only be remedied by a miracle. Footnote: a similar instance of divine substitution is known to us in the case of two other sovereigns, namely Amenophes III, whose father Thutmosis IV was born under conditions analogous to those attending the birth of Thutmosis I, and Ptolemy Caesarion, whose father Julius Caesar was not of Egyptian blood. End footnote. And the ancestral god, becoming incarnate in the earthly father at the moment of conception, had to condescend to infuse fresh virtue into his race in this manner. The inscriptions with which Hatshepsut decorated her chapel relate how, on that fateful night, Amon descended upon Ahmasi in a flood of perfume and light. The queen received him favorably, and the divine spouse, on leaving her, announced to her the approaching birth of a daughter, in whom his valor and strength should be manifested once more here below. The sequel of the story is displayed in a series of pictures before our eyes. The protecting divinities who preside over the birth of children conduct the queen to her couch, and the sorrowful resignation depicted on her face, together with the languid grace of her whole figure, display in this portrait of her a finished work of art. The child enters the world amid shouts of joy, and the propitious genii who nourish both her and her double constitute themselves her nurses. At the appointed time, her earthly father summons the great nobles to a solemn festival, and presents to them his daughter, who is to reign with him over Egypt and the world. Footnote: the association of Hatshepsut with her father on the throne has now been placed beyond doubt by the inscriptions discovered and commented on by Neville in 1895. End footnote. From henceforth, Hatshepsut adopts every possible device to conceal her real sex. She changes the termination of her name and calls herself Hatshepsut, the chief of the nobles, in lieu of Hatshepsut, the chief of the favorites. She becomes the king Makeri, and on the occasion of all public ceremonies she appears in male costume. We see her represented on the Theban monuments with uncovered shoulders, devoid of breasts, wearing the short loincloth and the keffiyeh, while the diadem rests on her closely cut hair and the false beard depends from her chin. She retained, however, the feminine pronoun in speaking of herself, and also an epithet inserted in her cartouche, which declared her to be the betrothed of Amon, Knumet Amaunu. Footnote: we know how greatly puzzled the early Egyptologists were by this manner of depicting the queen, and how Champollion, in striving to explain the monuments of the period, was driven to suggest the existence of a regent, Amenenethes, the male counterpart and husband of Hatshepsut, whose name he read Amense. This hypothesis, adopted by Rossellini, with some slight modifications, was rejected by Birch. This latter writer pointed out the identity of the two personages separated by Champollion and proved them to be one and the same queen, the Amenses of Manetho. He called her Amenumhk, but he made her out to be a sister of Amenophes I, associated on the throne with her brothers Thutmosis I and Thutmosis II, and regent at the beginning of the reign of Thutmosis III. Hinex tried to show that she was a daughter of Thutmosis I, the wife of Thutmosis II, and the sister of Thutmosis III. It is only quite recently that her true descent and place in the family tree has been recognized. She was not the sister, but the aunt of Thutmosis III. The queen, called by Birch Amenumhet, the latter part of her name being dropped and the royal prenomen being joined to her own name, was subsequently styled Ha'asu or Hatasu, and this form is still adopted by some writers. The true reading is Hatshepsut or Hatshepsut, then Hatshepsiu or Hatshepsiu, as Neville has pointed out. End footnote. Her father united her while still young to her brother Thutmosis, who appears to have been her junior, and this fact doubtless explains the very subordinate part which he plays beside the queen. When Thutmosis I died, Egyptian etiquette demanded that a man should be at the head of affairs, and this youth succeeded his father in office. But Hatshepsut, while relinquishing the semblance of power and the externals of pomp to her husband. Footnote: it is evident from the expressions employed by Thutmosis I in associating his daughter with himself on the throne that she was unmarried at the time, and Neville thinks that she married her brother Thutmosis II after the death of her father. It appears to me more probable that Thutmosis I married her to her brother after she had been raised to the throne, with a view to avoiding complications which might have arisen in the royal family after his own death. The inscription at Shut-er-Ragel, which was furnished Mariette with the hypothesis that Thutmose I and Thutmose II reigned simultaneously, proves that the person mentioned in it, a certain Penaiti, flourished under both these pharaohs, but by no means shows that these two reigned together. He exercised the functions which he held by their authority during their successive reigns. End footnote. Kept the direction of the state entirely in her own hands. The portraits of her which have been preserved represent her as having refined features with a proud and energetic expression. The oval of the face is elongated, the cheeks a little hollow, and the eyes deep set under the arch of the brow, while the lips are thin and tightly closed. She governed with so firm a hand that neither Egypt nor its foreign vassals dared to make any serious attempt to withdraw themselves from her authority. One raid, in which several prisoners were taken, punished a rising of the Shaosu in central Syria, while the usual expeditions maintained order among the peoples of Ethiopia and quenched any attempt which they might make to revolt. When in the second year of his reign the news was brought to Thutmose II that the inhabitants of the Upper Nile had ceased to observe the conditions which his father had imposed upon them, he, quote, became furious as a panther, end quote, and assembling his troops set out for war without further delay. The presence of the king with the army filled the rebels with dismay, and a campaign of a few weeks put an end to their attempt at rebelling. End of section 28, read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 29 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Part 4. The earlier kings of the 18th dynasty had chosen for their last resting place a spot on the left bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the cultivated land joined the desert, close to the pyramids built by their predecessors. Probably, after the burial of Amenopheus, the space was fully occupied, for Thutmose I had to seek his burying ground some way up the ravine, the mouth of which was blocked by their monuments. The Libyan chain here forms a kind of amphitheater of vertical cliffs, which descend to within some 90 feet of the valley, where a sloping mass of detritus connects them by a gentle declivity with the plain. The great lords and queens in the times of the Antufs and the Ursartassins had taken possession of this spot, but their chapels were by this period in ruins, and their tombs almost all lay buried under the waves of sand, which the wind from the desert drives perpetually over the summit of the cliffs. This site was seized on by the architects of Thutmose, who laid there the foundations of a building which was destined to be unique in the world. Its ground plan consisted of an avenue of sphinxes, starting from the plain and running between the tombs till it reached a large courtyard, terminated on the west by a colonnade, which was supported by a double row of pillars. Above and beyond this was the vast middle platform. Footnote. The English nomenclature employed in describing this temple is that used in the guide to Deir el-Bahari, translated by the Egypt Exploration Fund, TR. End footnote. Connected with the upper court by the central causeway which ran through it from end to end. This middle platform, like that below it, was terminated on the west by a double colonnade, through which access was gained to two chapels hollowed out of the mountainside, while on the north it was bordered with excellent effect by a line of protodorio columns ranged against the face of the cliff. This northern colonnade was never completed, but the existing part is of as exquisite proportions as anything that Greek art has ever produced. At length we reached the upper platform, a nearly square courtyard, cutting on one side into the mountain slope, the opposite side being enclosed by a wall pierced by a single door, while to right and left ran two lines of buildings destined for purposes connected with the daily worship of the temple. The sanctuary was cut out of the solid rock, but the walls were faced with white limestone. Some of the chambers are vaulted, and all of them decorated with bas-reliefs of exquisite workmanship, perhaps the finest examples of this period. Thutmose I scarcely did more than lay the foundations of this magnificent building, but his mummy was buried in it with great pomp, to remain there until a period of disturbance and general insecurity obliged those in charge of the necropolis to remove the body, together with those of his family, to some secure hiding place. Footnote. Both E. de Rouge and Mariette were opposed to the view that the temple was founded by Thutmose I, and Naville agrees with them. Judging from the many new texts discovered by Naville, I am inclined to think that Thutmose I began the structure, but from plans, it would appear, which had not been so fully developed as they afterwards became. From indications to be found here and there in the inscriptions of the Ramesside period, I am not, moreover, inclined to regard Deir el-Bahari as the funerary chapel of tombs, which were situated in some unknown place elsewhere, but I believe that it included the burial places of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Queen Hatshepsut, and of numerous representatives of their family. Indeed, it is probable that Thutmose III and his children found here also their last resting place. End footnote. The king was already advanced in age at the time of his death, being over 50 years old to judge by the incisor teeth, which are worn and corroded by the impurities of which the Egyptian bread was full. The body, though small and emaciated, shows evidence of unusual muscular strength. The head is bald, the features are refined, and the mouth still bears an expression characteristic of shrewdness and cunning. Footnote. The coffin of Thutmose I was usurped by the priest-king Pinozmu I, son of Pionki, and the mummy was lost. I fancy I have discovered it in mummy number 5283, of which the head presents a striking resemblance to those of Thutmose II and Thutmose III. End footnote. Thutmose II carried on the works begun by his father, but did not long survive him. Footnote. The latest year up to the present known of this king is the second, found upon the Aswan stele. Erman, followed by E.D. Meyer, thinks that Hatshepsut could not have been free from complicity in the premature death of Thutmose II, but I am inclined to believe, from the marks of disease found on the skin of his mummy, that the queen was innocent of the crime here ascribed to her. End footnote. The mask on his coffin represents him with a smiling and amiable countenance, and with the fine, pathetic eyes which show his descent from the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty. His statues bear the same expression, which indeed is that of the mummy itself. He resembles Thutmose I, but his features are not so marked, and are characterized by greater gentleness. He had scarcely reached the age of 30 when he fell a victim to a disease of which the process of embalming could not remove the traces. The skin is scabrous in patches and covered with scars, while the upper part of the skull is bald. The body is thin and somewhat shrunken, and appears to have lacked vigor and muscular power. By his marriage with his sister, Thutmose left daughters only. Footnote. 2 daughters of Queen Hatshepsut I are known, of whom No-Feruri died young, and Hatshepsut II, Martriri, who was married to her half-brother on her father's side, Thutmose III, who was thus her cousin as well. Amenophes II was offspring of this marriage. End footnote. But he had one son, also a Thutmose, by a woman of low birth, perhaps merely a slave, whose name was Isis. Footnote. The name of the mother of Thutmose III was revealed to us on the wrappings found with the mummy of this king in the hiding place of Deir el-Bahari. The absence of princely titles, while it shows the humble extraction of the Lady Isis, explains at the same time the somewhat obscure relations between Hatshepsut and her nephew. End footnote. Hatshepsut proclaimed this child her successor, for his youth and humble patronage could not excite her jealousy. She betrothed him to her one surviving daughter, Hatshepsut II, and having thus settled the succession in the male line, she continued to rule alone in the name of her nephew, who was still a minor, as she had done formerly in the case of her half-brother. Her reign was a prosperous one, but whether the flourishing condition of things was owing to the ability of her political administration or to her fortunate choice of ministers, we are unable to tell. She pressed forward the work of building with great activity, under the direction of her architect Sanmut, not only at Deir el-Bahari, but at Karnak, and indeed everywhere in Thebes. The plans of the building had been arranged under Thutmose I, and their execution had been carried out so quickly that in many cases the queen had merely to see to the sculptural ornamentation on the all but completed walls. This work, however, afforded her sufficient excuse, according to Egyptian custom, to attribute the whole structure to herself, and the opinion she had of her own powers is exhibited with great naiveness in her inscriptions. She loves to pose as premeditating her actions long beforehand, and as never venturing on the smallest undertaking without reference to her divine Father. Quote, "This is what I teach to mortals who shall live in centuries to come, and whose hearts shall inquire concerning the monument which I have raised to my Father, speaking and exclaiming as they contemplate it. As for me, when I sat in the palace and thought upon him who created me, my heart prompted me to raise to him 2 obelisks of electrum, whose apices should pierce the firmaments, before the noble gateway which is between the 2 great pylons of the king Thutmosis I. And my heart led me to address these words to those who shall see my monuments in after years, and who shall speak of my great deeds. Beware of saying, I know not why it was resolved to carve this mountain wholly of gold. These 2 obelisks, my majesty has made them of electrum, for my father Amon, that my name shall remain and live on in this temple forever and ever. For this single block of granite has been cut, without let or obstacle at the desire of my majesty, between the 1st of the 2nd month of Purit of the 5th year, and the 30th of the 4th month of Shomu of the 6th year, which makes 7 months from the day when they began to quarry it. End quote. One of these 2 monoliths is still standing among the ruins of Karnak, and the grace of its outline, the finish of its hieroglyphics, and the beauty of the figures which cover it amply justify the pride which the queen and her brother felt in contemplating it. The tops of the pyramids were gilt so that, quote, they could be seen from both banks of the river, end quote, and, quote, their brilliancy lit up the 2 lands of Egypt, end quote. Needless to say, these metal apices have long disappeared. Later on, in the queen's reign, Amon enjoined a work which was more difficult to carry out. On a day when Hatshepsut had gone to the temple to offer prayers, quote, her supplications arose up before the throne of the Lord of Karnak, and a command was heard in the sanctuary, a behest of the god himself, that the ways which lead to Puanit should be explored, and that the roads to the ladders of incense should be trodden. End quote. Footnote. The word ladders is the translation of the Egyptian word katiu, employed in the text to designate the country laid out in terraces where the incense trees grew. Compare with a different meaning, the ladders of the eastern Mediterranean. End footnote. Gums required for the temple service had hitherto reached the Theban priests solely by means of foreign intermediaries, so that in the slow transport across Africa they lost much of their freshness, besides being defiled by passing through impure hands. In addition to these drawbacks, the merchants confounded under the one term aniti substances, which differed considerably both in value and character, several of them indeed scarcely coming under the category of perfumes, and hence being unacceptable to the gods. One kind, however, found favor with them above all others, being that which still abounds in Somaliland at the present day, a gum secreted by the incense sycamore. Footnote. From the form of the trees depicted on the monument, it is clear that the Egyptians went to Puanit in search of the Boswellia thorifera cart, but they brought back with them other products also, which they confounded together under the name incense. End footnote. It was accounted a pious work to send and obtain it direct from the locality in which it grew, and if possible, to procure the plants themselves for acclimatization in the Nile Valley. But the relations maintained in former times with the people of these aromatic regions had been suspended for centuries. Quote, none now climbed the ladders of incense, none of the Egyptians. They knew of them from hearsay, from the stories of people of ancient times, for these products were brought to the kings of the Delta, thy fathers, to one or other of them, from the times of thy ancestors, the kings of the Said, who lived of yore. End quote. All that could be recalled of this country was summed up in the facts that it lay to the south or to the extreme east, that from thence many of the gods had come into Egypt, while from out of it the sun rose anew every morning. Amon, in his omniscience, took upon himself to describe it and give an exact account of its position. Quote, the ladders of incense is a secret province of Tanutir. It is in truth a place of delight. I created it, and I thereto lead thy majesty, together with Mut, Hathor, Uarit, the lady of Puanit, Uarit Hikau, the magician and regent of the gods, that the aromatic gum may be gathered at will, that the vessels may be laden joyfully with living incense trees, and with all the products of this earth. End quote. Hatshepsut chose out 5 well-built galleys, and manned them with picked crews. She caused them to be laden with such merchandise as would be most attractive to the barbarians, and placing the vessels under the command of a royal envoy, she sent them forth on the Red Sea in quest of the incense. We are not acquainted with the name of the port from which the fleet set sail, nor do we know the number of weeks it took to reach the land of Puanit. Neither is there any record of the incidents which befell it by the way. It sailed past the places frequented by the mariners of the 12th dynasty, Suakin, Masawa, and the islands of the Red Sea, it touched at the country of the Ilam, which lay to the west of the Bab el-Mandeb, went safely through the straits, and landed at last in the land of perfumes on the Somali coast. Footnote: that part of Puwanit where the Egyptians landed was at first located in Arabia by Brusk, then transferred to Somaliland by Mariette, whose opinion was accepted by most Egyptologists. Dumachin, basing his hypothesis on a passage where Puwanit is mentioned as, quote, being on both sides of the sea, end quote, desired to apply the name to the Arabian as well as to the African coast, to Yemen and Hadramaut, as well as to Somaliland. This suggestion was adopted by Lieblein and subsequently by E.D. Meyer, who believed that its inhabitants were the ancestors of the Sabsians. Since then, Krall has endeavored to shorten the distance between this country and Egypt, and he places the Puwanit of Hatshepsut between Suakin and Masuwa. This was indeed the part of the country known under the 12th dynasty at the time when it was believed that the Nile emptied itself thereabouts into the Red Sea, in the vicinity of the island of the Serpent King. But I hold with Mariette that the Puwanit where the Egyptians of Hatshepsut's time landed is the present Somaliland, a view which is also shared by Neville, but which Brusk, in the latter years of his life, abandoned. End footnote. There, between the Bay of Zela and Bas Hafun, stretched the barbaric region, frequented in later times by the merchants of Meos, Hormos, and of Bernice. The first stations which the latter encountered beyond Cape Dira, Avails, Malau, Mundos, and Masilon, were merely open roadsteads offering no secure shelter, but beyond Masilon, the classical navigators reported the existence of several wadis, the last of which, the Elephant River, lying between Bas el-Il and Cape Guardafui, appears to have been large enough not only to afford anchorage to several vessels of light draft, but to permit of their performing easily any evolutions required. During the Roman period, it was there, and there only, that the best kind of incense could be obtained, and it was probably at this point also that the Egyptians of Hatshepsut's time landed. The Egyptian vessels sailed up the river till they reached a place beyond the influence of the tide, and then dropped anchor in front of a village scattered along a bank fringed with sycamores and palms. Footnote: I have shown from a careful examination of the bas-reliefs that the Egyptians must have landed not on the coast itself, as was at first believed, but in the estuary of a river, and this observation has been accepted as decisive by most Egyptologists. Besides this, newly discovered fragments show the presence of a hippopotamus. Since then, I have sought to identify the landing place of the Egyptians with the most important of the creeks mentioned by the Greco-Roman merchants as accessible for their vessels, namely that which they called the Elephant River, near to the present Ras el Fil. End footnote. The huts of the inhabitants were of circular shape, each being surmounted with a conical roof. Some of them were made of closely plated osiers, and there was no opening in any of them save the door. They were built upon piles as a protection from the rise of the river and from wild animals, and access to them was gained by means of movable ladders. Oxen chewing the cud rested beneath them. The natives belonged to a light-colored race, and the portraits we possess of them resemble the Egyptian type in every particular. They were tall and thin, and of a color which varied between brick red and the darkest brown. Their beards were pointed, and the hair was cut short in some instances, while in others it was arranged in close rows of curls or in small plaits. The costume of the men consisted of a loincloth only, while the dress of the women was a yellow garment without sleeves, drawn in at the waist and falling halfway below the knee. The royal envoy landed under an escort of 8 soldiers and an officer, but, to prove his pacific intentions, he spread out upon a low table a variety of presents, consisting of 5 bracelets, 2 gold necklaces, a dagger with strap and sheath complete, a battle-axe, and 11 strings of glass beads. The inhabitants, dazzled by the display of so many valuable objects, ran to meet the newcomers, headed by their sheik, and expressed a natural astonishment at the sight of the strangers. Quote, "How is it," end quote, they exclaimed, quote, "that you have reached this country hitherto unknown to men? Have you come down by way of the sky, or have you sailed on the waters of the Tonatur Sea? You have followed the path of the sun, for as for the king of the land of Egypt, it is not possible to elude him, and we live, yea, we ourselves, by the breath which he gives us." End quote. The name of their chief was Parahu, who was distinguished from his subjects by the boomerang which he carried, and also by his dagger and necklace of beads. His right leg, moreover, appears to have been covered with a kind of sheath composed of rings of some yellow metal, probably gold. Footnote: Marriott compares this kind of armor to the dangabor of the Congo tribes, but the dangabor is worn on the arm. Livingstone saw a woman, the sister of Sebetuane, the highest lady of the Seskete, who wore on each leg 18 rings of solid brass as thick as the finger, and 3 rings of copper above the knee. The weight of these shining rings impeded her walking and produced sores on her ankles, but it was the fashion, and the inconvenience became nothing. As to the pain, it was relieved by a bit of rag applied to the lower rings. End footnote. He was accompanied by his wife Ati, riding on an ass, from which she alighted in order to gain a closer view of the strangers. She was endowed with a type of beauty much admired by the people of Central Africa, being so inordinately fat that the shape of her body was scarcely recognizable under the rolls of flesh which hung down from it. Her daughter, who appeared to be still young, gave promise of one day rivaling, if not exceeding, her mother in size. Footnote: These are 2 instances of abnormal fat production, the earliest with which we are acquainted. End footnote. End of section 29. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 30 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Part 5. After an exchange of compliments, the more serious business of the expedition was introduced. The Egyptians pitched a tent in which they placed the objects of barter with which they were provided, and to prevent these from being too great a temptation to the natives, they surrounded the tent with a line of troops. The main conditions of the exchange were arranged at a banquet, in which they spread before the barbarians a sumptuous display of Egyptian delicacies, consisting of bread, beer, wine, meat, and carefully prepared and flavored vegetables. Payment for every object was to be made at the actual moment of purchase. For several days there was a constant stream of people, and asses groaned beneath their burdens. The Egyptian purchases comprised the most varied objects: ivory tusks, gold, ebony, cassia, myrrh, cynocephaly, and green monkeys, greyhounds, leopard skins, large oxen, slaves, and last, but not least, 31 incense trees, with their roots surrounded by a ball of earth and placed in large baskets. The loading of the ships was a long and tedious affair. All available space being at length exhausted, and as much cargo placed on board as was compatible with the navigation of the vessel, the squadron set sail and with all speed took its way northwards. The Egyptians touched at several places on the coast on their return journey, making friendly alliances with the inhabitants. The Ilam added a quota to their freight, for which room was with difficulty found on board. It consisted not only of the inevitable gold, ivory, and skins, but also of live leopards and a giraffe, together with plants and fruits unknown on the banks of the Nile. Footnote: Lieblin thought that their country was explored not by the sailors who voyaged to Puanet, but by a different body who proceeded by land, and this view was accepted by E.D. Meyer. The completed text proves that there was but a single expedition, and that the explorers of Puanet visited the Ilam also. The giraffe which they gave does not appear in the cargo of the vessels at Puanet. The visit must, therefore, have been paid on the return voyage, and the giraffe was probably represented on the destroyed part of the walls where Neville found the image of this animal wandering at liberty among the woods. End footnote. The fleet at length made its reappearance in Egyptian ports, having on board the chiefs of several tribes on whose coasts the sailors had landed, and, quote, bringing back so much that the like had never been brought of the products of Puanet to other kings by the supreme favor of the venerable god Amun-Ra, lord of Karnak. End quote. The chiefs mentioned were probably young men of superior family who had been confided to the officer in command of the squadron by local sheiks, as pledges to the pharaoh of goodwill or as commercial hostages. National vanity, no doubt, prompted the Egyptians to regard them as vassals coming to do homage, and their gifts as tributes denoting subjection. The queen inaugurated a solemn festival in honor of the explorers. The Theban militia was ordered out to meet them, the royal flotilla escorting them as far as the temple landing place, where a procession was formed to carry the spoil to the feet of the god.
The good Theban folk assembled to witness their arrival beheld the march past of the native hostages, the incense sycamores, the precious gum itself, the wild animals, the giraffe, and the oxen, whose numbers were doubtless increased 100-fold in the accounts given to posterity with the usual official exaggeration. The trees were planted at Deir el-Bahari, where a sacred garden was prepared for them, square trenches being cut in the rock and filled with earth, in which the sycamore, by frequent watering, came to flourish well. Footnote: Neville found these trenches still filled with vegetable mold, and in several of them roots, which gave every indication of the purpose to which the trenches were applied. A scene represents 7 of the incense sycamores still growing in their pots, and offered by the queen to the majesty, quote, of this god Amun-Ra of Karnak, end quote. End footnote. The great heaps of fresh resin were next the objects of special attention. Hatshepsut, quote, gave a bushel made of electrum to gauge the massive gum, it being the first time that they had the joy of measuring the perfumes of Amun, lord of Karnak, master of heaven, and of presenting to him the wonderful products of Puanat. Thought, the lord of Hermopolis, noted the quantities in writing. Saf-Kitabui verified the list. Her Majesty herself prepared from it, with her own hands, a perfumed unguent for her limbs. She gave forth the smell of the divine dew. Her perfume reached even to Puanat. Her skin became like wrought gold. Footnote: in order to understand the full force of the imagery here employed, one must remember that the Egyptian artists painted the flesh of women as light yellow. End footnote. And her countenance shone like the stars in the great festival hall in the sight of the whole earth. End quote. Hatshepsut commanded the history of the expedition to be carved on the wall of the colonnades which lay on the west side of the middle platform of her funerary chapel. We there see the little fleet with sails spread, winging its way to the unknown country, its safe arrival at its destination, the meeting with the natives, the animated palavering, the consent to exchange freely accorded, and thanks to the minuteness with which the smallest details have been portrayed, we can, as it were, witness, as if on the spot, all the phases of life on board ship, not only on Egyptian vessels, but, as we may infer, those of other Oriental nations generally. For we may be tolerably sure that when the Phoenicians ventured into the distant parts of the Mediterranean, it was after a similar fashion that they managed and armed their vessels. Although the natural features of the Asiatic or Greek coast on which they effected a landing differed widely from those of Puanat, the Phoenician navigators were themselves provided with similar objects of exchange, and in their commercial dealings with the natives, the methods of procedure of the European traders were doubtless similar to those of the Egyptians with the barbarians of the Red Sea. Hatshepsut reigned for at least 8 years after this memorable expedition, and traces of her further activity are to be observed in every part of the Nile Valley. She even turned her attention to the Delta and began the task of reorganizing this part of her kingdom, which had been much neglected by her predecessors. The wars between the Theban princes and the lords of Avaris had lasted over a century, and during that time no one had had either sufficient initiative or leisure to superintend the public works, which were more needed here than in any other part of Egypt. The canals were silted up with mud, the marshes and the desert had encroached on the cultivated lands, the towns had become impoverished, and there were some provinces whose population consisted solely of shepherds and bandits. Hatshepsut desired to remedy these evils, if only for the purpose of providing a practicable road for her armies marching to Zalu en route for Syria. Footnote: this follows from the great inscription at Stabal Antar, which is commonly interpreted as proving that the shepherd kings still held sway in Egypt in the reign of Thutmose III, and that they were driven out by him and his aunt. It seems to me that the queen is simply boasting that she had repaired the monuments which had been injured by the shepherds during the time they sojourned in Egypt in the land of Avaris. Up to the present time, no trace of these restorations has been found on the sites. The expedition to Puanat being mentioned in lines 13-14, they must be of later date than the year 9 of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. End footnote. She also turned her attention to the mines of Sinai, which had not been worked by the Egyptian kings since the end of the 12th dynasty. In the year 16, an officer of the queen's household was dispatched to the Wadi Maghara, the site of the ancient works, with orders to inspect the valleys, examine the veins, and restore there the temple of the goddess Hathor. Having accomplished his mission, he returned, bringing with him a consignment of those blue and green stones which were so highly esteemed by the Egyptians. Meanwhile, Thutmose III was approaching manhood, and his aunt, the queen, instead of abdicating in his favor, associated him with her more frequently in the external acts of government. Footnote: the account of the youth of Thutmose III, such as Brusque made it out to be from an inscription of this king, the exile of the royal child at Buto, his long sojourn in the marshes, his triumphal return, must all be rejected. Brusque accepted as actual history a poetical passage where the king identifies himself with Horus, son of Isis, and goes so far as to attribute to himself the adventures of the god. End footnote. She was forced to yield him precedence in those religious ceremonies which could be performed by man only, such as the dedication of one of the city gates of Ombus, and the foundation and marking out of a temple at Medinet Habu, but for the most part she obliged him to remain in the background and take a secondary place beside her. We are unable to determine the precise moment when this dual sovereignty came to an end. It was still existent in the 16th year of the reign, but it had ceased before the 22nd year. Death alone could take the scepter from the hands that held it, and Thutmose had to curb his impatience for many a long day before becoming the real master of Egypt. He was about 25 years of age when this event took place, and he immediately revenged himself for the long repression he had undergone by endeavoring to destroy the very remembrance of her whom he regarded as a usurper. Every portrait of her that he could deface without exposing himself to being accused of sacrilege was cut away, and he substituted for her name either that of Thutmose I or Thutmose II. A complete political change was effected both at home and abroad from the first day of his accession to power. Hatshepsut had been averse to war. During the whole of her reign, there had not been a single campaign undertaken beyond the Isthmus of Suez, and by the end of her life, she had lost nearly all that her father had gained in Syria. The people of Karu had shaken off the yoke. Footnote: E. de Rouge thought that he had discovered, in a slightly damaged inscription bearing upon the Puanan expedition, the mention of a tribute paid by the Lotenu. There is nothing in the passage cited but the mention of the usual annual dues paid by the chiefs of Puanat and of the Ilam. End footnote. Probably at the instigation of the king of the Amorites. Footnote: this is at least what may be inferred from the account of the campaign, where the prince of Kodshu, a town of the Amaru, Amorites, figures at the head of the coalition formed against Thutmose III. End footnote. And nothing remained to Egypt of the Asiatic province but Gaza, Sharuhana. Footnote: this is the conclusion to be adopted from the beginning of the inscription of Thutmose III. Quote: now, during the duration of these same years, the country of the Lotenu was in discord until other times succeeded them, when the people who were in the town of Sharuhana, from the town of Yurza to the most distant regions of the earth, succeeded in making a revolt against his majesty. End quote. End footnote. And the neighboring villages. The young king set out with his army in the latter days of the year 22. He reached Gaza on the 3rd of the month of Pakhons, in time to keep the anniversary of his coronation in that town, and to inaugurate the 24th year of his reign by festivals in honor of his father Amon. Footnote: the account of this campaign has been preserved to us on a wall adjoining the granite sanctuary at Karnak. End footnote. They lasted the usual length of time, and all the departments of state took part in them, but it was not a propitious moment for lengthy ceremonies. The king left Gaza the following day, the 5th of Pakhons. He marched but slowly at first, following the usual caravan route, and dispatching troops right and left to levy contributions on the cities of the plain, Migdol, Yapu, Jaffa, Lotenu, Ono, and those within reach on the mountain spurs or situated within the easily accessible wadis, such as Sauka, Socho, Hadid, and Haralu. On the 16th day, he had not proceeded further than Yahmu, where he received information which caused him to push quickly forward. The lord of Kodshu had formed an alliance with the Syrian princes on the borders of Nahraim, and had extorted from them promises of help. He had already gone so far as to summon contingents from the Upper Orontes, the Litany, and the Upper Jordan, and was concentrating them at Megiddo, where he proposed to stop the way of the invading army. Thutmose called together his principal officers, and having imparted the news to them, took counsel with them as to a plan of attack. 3 alternative routes were open to him. The most direct approached the enemy's position on the front, crossing Mount Carmel by the saddle now known as the el Fam. The great drawback attached to this route was its being so restricted that the troops would be forced to advance in too thin a file, and the head of the column would reach the plain and come into actual conflict with the enemy, while the rear guard would only be entering the defiles in the neighborhood of Aluna. The second route bore a little to the east, crossing the mountains beyond Dutina and reaching the plain near Ta'anak, but it offered the same disadvantages as the other. The third road ran north of Zafiti to meet the great highway which cuts the hill districts of Nablus, skirting the foot of Tabor near Jenin, a little to the north of Megiddo. It was not so direct as the other two, but it was easier for troops, and the king's generals advised that it should be followed. The king was so incensed that he was tempted to attribute their prudence to cowardice. Quote, "By my life, by the love that Ra hath for me, by the favor that I enjoy from my master Amon, by the favor that I enjoy from my master Amen, by the perpetual youth of my nostril and life and power, my majesty will go by the way of Aluna, and let him that will go by the roads of which ye have spoken, and let him that will follow my majesty. What will be said among the vile enemies detested of Ra? Doth not his majesty go by another way? For fear of us he gives us a wide berth, they will cry." End quote. The king's counselors did not insist further. Quote, "May thy father, Amen of Thebes, protect thee." End quote. They exclaimed, quote, "As for us, we will follow thy majesty whithersoever thou goest, as it befitteth a servant to follow his master." End quote. The word of command was given to the men. Thutmosis himself led the vanguard, and the whole army, horsemen and foot soldiers, followed in a single file, wending their way through the thickets which covered the southern slopes of Mount Carmel. Footnote: the position of the towns mentioned and of the three roads has been discussed by E. de Rouge, also by P. de Salcy, who fixed the position of Yahmu at El Kheimeh, and showed that the Egyptian army must have passed through the defiles of el Ram. Condor disagreed with this opinion in certain respects and identified Aruna at first with Arabeh and afterwards with Araneh. He thought that Thutmosis came out upon Megiddo from the southeast, and he placed Megiddo at Megiddo near Beisan, while Tompkins placed Aruna in the Wadi el Aryan. W. Maximilier seems to place Yahinu too much to the north, in the neighborhood of Jet. End footnote. They pitched their camp on the evening of the 19th near Aluna, and on the morning of the 20th they entered the wild defiles through which it was necessary to pass in order to reach the enemy. The king had taken precautionary measures against any possible attempt of the natives to cut the main column during this crossing of the mountains. His position might at any moment have become a critical one had the Allies taken advantage of it and attacked each battalion as it issued onto the plain before it could reform. But the Prince of Kodshu, either from ignorance of his adversary's movements or confident of victory in the open, declined to take the initiative. Towards 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Egyptians found themselves once more united on the further side of the range, close to a torrent called the Kina, a little to the south of Megiddo. When the camp was pitched, Thutmosis announced his intention of engaging the enemy on the morrow. A council of war was held to decide on the position that each corps should occupy, after which the officers returned to their men to see that a liberal supply of rations was served out, and to organize an efficient system of patrols. They passed round the camp to cry, quote, "Keep a good heart, courage, watch well, keep alive in the camp," end quote. The king refused to retire to rest until he had been assured that, quote, "the country was quiet and also the host, both to south and north," end quote. By dawn the next day, the whole army was in motion. It was formed into a single line, the right wing protected by the torrent, the left extended into the plain, stretching beyond Megiddo towards the northwest. Thutmosis and his guards occupied the center, standing, quote, "armed in his chariot of electrum, like unto Horus brandishing his pike, and like Montu the Theban god," end quote. The Syrians, who had not expected such an early attack, were seized with panic and fled in the direction of the town, leaving their horses and chariots on the field. But the citizens, fearing lest in the confusion the Egyptians should effect an entrance with the fugitives, had closed their gates and refused to open them. Some of the townspeople, however, let down ropes to the leaders of the allied party and drew them up to the top of the ramparts. Quote, "And would to heaven that the soldiers of his majesty had not so far forgotten themselves as to gather up the spoil left by the vile enemy. they would then have entered Megiddo forthwith. For while the men of the garrison were drawing up the Lord of Kodshu and their own prince, the fear of his majesty was upon their limbs, and their hands failed them by reason of the carnage which the royal Urias carried into their ranks." End quote. The victorious soldiery were dispersed over the fields, gathering together the gilded and silvered chariots of the Syrian chiefs, collecting the scattered weapons in the hands of the slain, and securing the prisoners. Then, rallying about the king, they greeted him with acclamations and filed past to deliver up the spoil. He reproached them for having allowed themselves to be drawn away from the heat of pursuit. Quote, "Had you carried Megiddo, it would have been a favor granted to me by Ra, my father, this day. For all the kings of the country being shut up within it, it would have been as the taking of 1,000 towns to have seized Megiddo." End quote. The Egyptians had made little progress in the art of besieging a stronghold since the times of the 12th dynasty. When scaling failed, they had no other resource than a blockade, and even the most stubborn of the pharaohs would naturally shrink from the tedium of such an undertaking. Thutmosis, however, was not inclined to lose the opportunity of closing the campaign by a decisive blow, and began the investment of the town according to the prescribed modes. His men were placed under canvas, and working under the protection of immense shields, supported on posts, they made a ditch around the walls, strengthening it with a palisade. The king constructed also on the east side a fort which he called Manakpiri, holds the Asiatics. Famine soon told on the demoralized citizens, and their surrender brought about the submission of the entire country. Most of the countries situated between the Jordan and the sea, Shunem, Kana, Kinnereth, Hazor, Badippa, Laish, Merom, and Acre, besides the cities of the Haran, Hamath, Magato, Ashtaroth, Onorepha, and even Damascus itself, recognized the suzerainty of Egypt, and their lords came into the camp to do homage. Footnote: the names of these towns are inscribed on the lists of Karnak published by Mariette. End footnote. End of section 30. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 31 of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Part 6. The Syrian losses did not amount to more than 83 killed and 400 prisoners, showing how easily they had been routed, but they had abandoned considerable supplies, all of which had fallen into the hands of the victors. Some 724 chariots, 2,041 mares, 200 suits of armor, 602 bows, the tent of the Prince of Kodshu with its poles of cypress inlaid with gold, besides oxen, cows, goats, and more than 20,000 sheep were among the spoil. Before quitting the plain of Esdraelon, the king caused an official survey of it to be made and had the harvest reaped. It yielded 208,000 bushels of wheat, not taking into account what had been looted or damaged by the marauding soldiery. The return homewards of the Egyptians must have resembled the exodus of some emigrating tribe rather than the progress of a regular army. Thutmosis caused a long list of the vanquished to be engraved on the walls of the temple which he was building at Karnak, thus affording the good people of Thebes an opportunity for the first time of reading on the monuments the titles of the king's Syrian subjects written in hieroglyphics. 119 names follow each other in unbroken succession, some of them representing mere villages, while others denoted powerful nations. The catalogue, however, was not to end even here. Having once set out on a career of conquest, the pharaoh had no inclination to lay aside his arms. From the 12th year of his reign to that of his death, we have a record of 12 military expeditions, all of which he led in person. Southern Syria was conquered at the outset, the whole of Karu as far as the lake of Genesareth, and the Amorite power was broken at one blow. The 3 succeeding campaigns consolidated the rule of Egypt in the country of the Negeb, which lay to the southwest of the Dead Sea, and Phoenicia, which prudently resigned itself to its fate, and in that part of Lotani occupying the northern part of the basin of the Orontes. Footnote: we know of these 3 campaigns from the indirect testimony of the annals, which end in the year 29, with the mention of the 5th campaign. The only dated one is referred to the year 25, and we know of that of the Negeb only by the inscription of Amenemhabi, 11, 3-5. The campaign began in the Negeb of Judah, but the king carried it to Nahraim the same year.
End footnote. None of these expeditions appear to have been marked by any success comparable to the victory at Megiddo, for the coalition of the Syrian chiefs did not survive the blow which they then sustained. But Kochu long remained the center of resistance, and the successive defeats which its inhabitants suffered never disarmed for more than a short interval the hatred which they felt for the Egyptian. During these years of glorious activity, considerable tribute poured into both Memphis and Thebes. Not only ingots of gold and silver, bars and blocks of copper and lead,
blocks of lapis lazuli, and valuable vases,
but horses, oxen, sheep, goats, and useful animals of every kind, in addition to all of which we find, as in Hatshepsut's reign, the mention of rare plants and shrubs brought back from countries traversed by the armies in their various expeditions. The Theban priests and savants exhibited much interest in such curiosities, and their royal pupil gave orders to his generals to collect for their benefit all that appeared either rare or novel. They endeavored to acclimatize the species or the varieties likely to be useful, and in order to preserve a record of these experiments, they caused the representation of the strange plants or animals to be drawn on the walls of one of the chapels which they were then building to one of their gods. These pictures may still be seen there in interminable lines, portraying the specimens brought from the Upper Lotanu in the 25th year of Thutmosis, and we are able to distinguish, side by side with many plants peculiar to the regions of the Euphrates, others having their habitat in the mountains and valleys of tropical Africa. This return to an aggressive policy on the part of the Egyptians, after the weakness they had exhibited during the later period of Hatshepsut's regency, seriously disconcerted the Asiatic sovereigns. They had vainly flattered themselves that the invasion of Thutmosis I was merely the caprice of an adventurous prince, and they hoped that when his love of enterprise had expended itself, Egypt would permanently withdraw within her traditional boundaries, and that the relations of Elam with Babylon, Carchemish with Kodshu, and the barbarians of the Persian Gulf with the inhabitants of the Iranian tableland would resume their former course. This vain delusion was dispelled by the advent of a new Thutmosis, who showed clearly by his actions that he intended to establish and maintain the sovereignty of Egypt over the western dependencies, at least, of the ancient Chaldean Empire, that is to say, over the countries which bordered the middle course of the Euphrates and the coasts of the Mediterranean. The audacity of his marches, the valor of his men, the facility with which in a few hours he had crushed the assembled forces of half Syria, left no room to doubt that he was possessed of personal qualities and material resources sufficient to carry out projects of the most ambitious character. Babylon, enfeebled by the perpetual dissensions of its Kassian princes, was no longer in a position to contest with him the little authority she still retained over the peoples of Nahraim or of Cilicia. Protected by the distance which separated her from the Nile Valley, she preserved a sullen neutrality, while Assyria hastened to form a peaceful alliance with the invading power. Again and again its kings sent to Thutmosis presents in proportion to their resources, and the pharaoh naturally treated their advances as undeniable proofs of their voluntary vassalage. Each time that he received from them a gift of metal or lapis lazuli, he proudly recorded their tribute in the annals of his reign, and if in exchange he sent them some Egyptian product, it was in smaller quantities, as might be expected from a lord to his vassal. Footnote: the tribute of Osir is mentioned in this way under the years 23 and 24. The presents sent by the pharaoh in return are not mentioned in any Egyptian text, but there is frequent reference to them in the Tel el Amarna tablets. It may be mentioned here that the name of Nineveh does not occur on the Egyptian monuments, but only that of the town Ni, in which Champollion wrongly recognized the later capital of Assyria. End footnote. Sometimes there would accompany the convoy, surrounded by an escort of slaves and women, some princess, whom the king would place in his harem or graciously pass on to one of his children. But when, on the other hand, an even distant relative of the pharaoh was asked in marriage for some king on the banks of the Tigris or Euphrates, the request was met with a disdainful negative. The daughters of the sun were of too noble a race to stoop to such alliances, and they would count it a humiliation to be sent in marriage to a foreign court. Free transit on the main road which ran diagonally through Karu was ensured by fortresses constructed at strategic points. Footnote: the castle, for instance, near Megiddo, previously referred to, which, after having contributed to the siege of the town, probably served to keep it in subjection. End footnote. And from this time forward, Thutmose was able to bring the whole force of his army to bear upon both Cilicia and Nahraim. Footnote. The accounts of the campaigns of Thutmose III have been preserved in the annals in a very mutilated condition, the fragments of which were discovered at different times. They are nothing but extracts from an official account, made for Amun and his priests. End footnote.
He encamped in the year 27 on the tableland separating the Afrin and the Orontes from the Euphrates,
and from that center devastated the district of Uanit. Footnote. The province of the tree Uanu. Compare with this designation the epithet Shad Irini, mountain of the cedar tree, which the Assyrians bestowed on the Amanus. End footnote. Which lay to the west of Aleppo, then crossing the water of Nahraim in the neighborhood of Carchemish, he penetrated into the heart of Mitanni. The following year he reappeared in the same region. Tunapa, which had made an obstinate resistance, was taken, together with its king, and 329 of his nobles were forced to yield themselves prisoners. Thutmose, quote, with a joyous heart, end quote, was carrying them away captive when it occurred to him that the district of Zahi, which lay away for the most part from the great military highroads, was a tempting prey teeming with spoil. The barns were stored with wheat and barley, the cellars were filled with wine, the harvest was not yet gathered in, and the trees bent under the weight of their fruit. Having pillaged Sinzauru on the Orontes, footnote, Sinzauru was thought by Ebers to be, quote, the double Tyre, end quote. Russ considered it to be Tyre itself. It is, I believe, the Caesarea of classical writers, the Shaizar of the Arabs, and is mentioned in one of the Tel el Amarna tablets in connection with Ni. End footnote. He made his way to the westwards through the ravine formed by the Ishar el Keber, and descended suddenly on the territory of Arvad. The towns once more escaped pillage, but Thutmose destroyed the harvests, plundered the orchards, carried off the cattle, and pitilessly wasted the whole of the maritime plain. There was such abundance within the camp that the men were continually getting drunk and spent their time in anointing themselves with oil, which they could do only in Egypt at the most solemn festivals. They returned to Syria in the year 30, and their good fortune again favored them. The stubborn Kodshu was harshly dealt with. Samira and Arvad, which hitherto had held their own, now opened their gates to him. The lords of the Upper Lotanu poured in their contributions without delay, and gave up their sons and brothers as hostages. In the year 31, the city of Anamut and Tikhisha, on the shores of Lake Nisrana, yielded in its turn. Footnote. The site of the Tikhisha country is imperfectly defined. Nisrana was seemingly applied to the marshy lake into which the Kowake flows, and it is perhaps to be found in the name Kin-Nesrin.
In this case, Takhisha would be the country near the lake.
The district of the Greco-Roman Chalkis is situated on the right of the military road. End footnote. On the 3rd of Pakhans, the anniversary of his coronation, the Lotanu renewed their homage to him in person. The return of the expedition was a sort of triumphal procession. At every halting place, the troops found quarters and provisions prepared for them, bread and cakes, perfumes, oil, wine, and honey, being provided in such quantities that they were obliged on their departure to leave the greater part behind them. The scribes took advantage of this peaceful state of affairs to draw up minute accounts of the products of Lotanu, corn, barley, millet, fruits, and various kinds of oil, prompted doubtless by the desire to arrive at a fairly just apportionment of the tribute. Indeed, the results of the expedition were considered so satisfactory that they were recorded on a special monument dedicated in the palace at Thebes. The names of the towns and peoples might change with every war, but the spoils suffered no diminution. In the year 33, the kingdoms situated to the west of the Euphrates were so far pacified that Thutmose was able without risk to carry his arms to Mesopotamia. He entered the country by the fords of Carchemish, near to the spot where his grandfather Thutmose I had erected his stele half a century previously. He placed another beside this, and a third to the eastward to mark the point to which he had extended the frontier of his empire. The Mitanni, who exercised a sort of hegemony over the whole of Nahraim, were this time the objects of his attack. 32 of their towns fell one after another, their kings were taken captive, and the walls of their cities were razed, without any serious resistance. The battalions of the enemy were dispersed at the first shock, and Pharaoh, quote, pursued them for the space of a mile without one of them daring to look behind him, for they thought only of escape and fled before him like a flock of goats, end quote. Thutmosis pushed forward as far certainly as the Balak, and perhaps on to the Khabur or even to the Hermus. And as he approached the frontier, the king of Singar, a vassal of Assyria, sent him presents of lapis lazuli. When this prince had retired, another chief, the lord of the great Khati, whose territory had not even been threatened by the invaders, deemed it prudent to follow the example of the petty princes of the plain of the Euphrates, and dispatched envoys to the pharaoh bearing presents of no great value, but testifying to his desire to live on good terms with Egypt. Still further on, the inhabitants of Ni begged the king's acceptance of a troop of slaves and 260 mares. He remained among them long enough to erect a stele commemorating his triumph, and to indulge in one of those extensive hunts which were the delight of Oriental monarchs. The country abounded in elephants. The soldiers were employed as beaters, and the king and his court succeeded in killing 120 head of big game, whose tusks were added to the spoils. These numbers indicate how the extinction of such animals in these parts was brought about. Beyond these regions, again, the sheiks of the Lamnaniu came to meet the pharaoh. They were a poor people and had but little to offer, but among their gifts were some birds of a species unknown to the Egyptians, and 2 geese, with which, however, his majesty deigned to be satisfied. Footnote: the campaign of the year 31. It is mentioned in the annals of Thutmosis III, 11, 17-27. The reference to the elephant hunt occurs only in the inscription of Amenemhabi, 11, 22-23. An allusion to the defeat of the kings of Mitanni is found in a mutilated inscription from the tomb of Mana Kipirasanbu. It was probably on his return from this campaign that Thutmosis caused the great list to be engraved, which, while it includes a certain number of names assigned to places beyond the Euphrates, ought necessarily to contain the cities of the Mitanni. End footnote. End of section 31. Read by Elsie Selwyn. End of History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 4 by Gaston Maspero, translated by M.L. McClure.